And now we begin the time with Agent Smith.
Hello.
What's up, dude?
No, not much.
Been a few weeks.
Yeah, it's been a few. You had the BlizzCon thing.
TwitchCon and BlizzCon back to back.
Oh, nice. How did it go?
It was fantastic. Really good business-wise. Got to meet a lot of people who I hadn't met, and then talked to some pretty awesome people. Hanging out with friends in the scene, that kind of stuff. And then, I don't know if you caught the news, but there was a very historic and new BlizzCon StarCraft Championship outcome.
Oh, yeah?
It was the first time someone who is not from South Korea won BlizzCon.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was pretty neat seeing the rumors kind of being whispered around from other BlizzCon attendees of other games. They're like, I think something happened to StarCraft. Something different. But yeah, Cyril, a guy from Finland, crushed it. It wasn't even like, oh, he barely won and he used a bunch of gimmicks. He was the best. So it was really awesome. Tons of energy there. The StarCraft area was totally packed.
Oh, sounds pretty fun.
It was. How have you been?
Oh, I've been fine. Not much exciting happening over here.
Abiding, surviving, learning.
Yeah, pretty much. Been working on the podcast, trying to get that done. Still aiming for release before December, ideally.
Mm-hmm.
That may or may not happen. But pushing on that and reading a lot about China since I started, like an idiot, I started up a new strategy game again, so that's been a big distraction. But
What game?
Oriental Empires.
Huh.
Kind of, it's a 4X builder,
Mm-hmm.
similar to Civ in a lot of ways. But it's set more in ancient China, so that's kind of sparked my interest in China again, so I've been wiki binging on that as well in my copious spare time. Pretty interesting stuff.
Sounds fun, at least.
Oh yeah, very very fun. Very interesting. But that's about it. I don't do a whole lot.
So, business-wise, in terms of like the stuff that has stuck out to me, the Saudi Arabia, Turkey journalism shenanigans, that's been unfolding over the past few weeks. It seems like it was the Crown Prince guy who asked for it to happen. And this is all off the back of, like, they thought they would just dispose of him and it would be fine, but the whole area was wiretapped, so there's a lot of hard evidence that they didn't expect would be there. Whoops.
Yeah. Yeah, the Turks are apparently observing what goes on there very closely.
Yeah, because they love journalists, right?
Oh, yeah.
So it's all about looking after the health and safety and well-being of journalists.
Yeah, that is kind of an open question as to just why it is that the Turkish government is coming down so hard on the Saudis. It's not really clear what they stand to gain. But Erdogan, of course, is known for being a sort of prototypical strongman-style leader, so it may be this is all just kind of a game on his part to generate some leverage so we can get some goodies out of the Saudi government of one sort or another. They are, to a degree, rivals for influence in the region, so perhaps it's not all that surprising. The Turkish government, under Erdogan, has long wanted to expand Turkey's influence in the region, so it may be that this is a way to try to do that. But I don't really know what the long-term game plan is. I don't really think this is going to be a really great way to undermine the Saudis. I mean, kind of like what we talked about the last time, the Saudis are probably not going to be ostracized for this. Probably there will be some superficial investigating, and then there will be some sort of superficial punishment of some group or another. I think the Saudi government has identified who was responsible for what they call a rogue operation, quote-unquote, and so those will probably be the people who are kind of offered as the ritual sacrifice for bad behavior in this case. But beyond that, I don't think there will be a breakdown in relations between, say, the United States and the West and the Saudi government.
Mm-hmm.
Probably they'll tell them, probably the West will tell the Saudi government that they'll let it slide this time, but that they'd better not do it again. Otherwise, they might take actual action of some sort or another.
Like, be upset.
Yeah, yeah. You know, they're in the future. It may not amount to much either, but probably. I mean, the whole incident has been very embarrassing for all involved, and Western governments in particular, because they want to have a relationship with the Saudi government. They want cooperation, especially on security matters, but also economic matters. But that's difficult to do politically if the Saudi government does things like this.
Mm-hmm.
So the attitude in the West publicly is going to be that it was a very bad thing and that there's going to be an investigation and maybe some superficial, voodoo dance to try to show that they're committed to human rights. But in private, there probably will be a lot of castigating. There'll probably be statements to the effect of, we want to work with you, we're not going to really come down on you hard this time, but this is very embarrassing. You need never to do this again, and if you do, then we're going to actually do something. And it won't be something you like. So most likely that'll be the medium to long-term outcome. I don't think there will be much coming out of it over the short term. But probably there will be a lot of pressure on the Saudis to make sure that they don't do anything like this again, or if they do, to at the very least have the common decency not to get caught.
Mm-hmm. We're upset that you got caught doing something bad. Why couldn't you have not been caught?
That would have been much more convenient. Yeah, it's been an eventful few weeks in different parts of the world, but is there anything in particular that you noticed that you found?
Well, someone was asking for you recently about some deep fakes of some journalist in the US that they were trying to heck over, basically, by creating some fake videotape to justify something, but I didn't read up on it, but that was approximately what was asked about.
I don't think I remember reading about anything to that effect, but I don't think the deepfake technology is really good enough to really be a good way to kind of frame somebody in that manner. It's still quite possible to tell fakes from the real article at this point, as far as deepfake technology. And for those who are not familiar with deepfake technology, basically it's a technology that allows you to I think it's an audio technology principally, isn't it?
Well, I have no idea.
I believe that to be the case anyway. Basically, you can record audio and have it sound like a given person's voice. Mm-hmm. And it's a very close approximation. And I think there's maybe it's not just audio, because I think there is also facial technology where they can take somebody's body and then change the face so that it looks like somebody else. And there's also technology that can make them look like they're saying something, so you can match the audio with the face and the speech. So the whole thing altogether is a relatively impressive technology that allows you to fake somebody saying something that they would not actually say, and then ascribe those statements to that person with corresponding fallout. But the facial technology is not the best. I think the voice technology is more convincing than the facial technology, so it's not that hard, per se, to note that, oh, hey, that's somebody's face being plastered onto somebody else's body. Mm-hmm. But that is kind of, I think right now, it's more of a long-term concern, because the technology is only going to improve. So in the future, it may not just be fake news that people talk about. It may be discussion about whether or not an actual, say, press conference or public statement by a given individual is actually authentic, and it may be increasingly difficult to decipher whether or not it's actually authentic. So there are issues there for political discourse, because obviously if you can't trust whether any given statement from somebody is actually accurate, that makes it problematic to communicate on the part of politicians their actual viewpoints. And even if you get to a point where it's widely known that given videos or whatnot could be fake or can be faked, the problem that then arises is that politicians can just argue, if they say something stupid or whatnot, they could just say, oh, that's a deep fake. That wasn't actually me. Mm-hmm. So there are sort of knock-on long-term effects in the future as well, once we kind of start adjusting to the new technology socially. Yeah, there are some deep concerns there, but overall, it's kind of an overarching conversation that ties into the issue of fake news and the authenticity of statements and how you respond to that, how do you adjust to that, what do you do about it. That's still a conversation very much in play. You know, that kind of comes down to personal preferences about how strong a regulatory regime is justified and how much risk you're willing to take in having a weak regulatory regime, and in turn, how much you're willing to kind of give up in exchange for, you know, all policies are cost benefit. All policies are trade-offs between costs and benefits. So, however you want to respond to the phenomena of fake information, you know, misinformation of one sort or another, there's always going to be a trade-off between taking a more active role, giving a more active role to government, and in turn giving up, risking, you know, misbehavior on the part of the government, among other costs, and the benefit then of having less pervasive misinformation, assuming that the government action is effective in dealing with it. That's not a given, but assuming that to be the case, the trade-off then is misbehavior versus less misinformation. And then on the other hand, taking a less active, giving less power to government to deal with the problem, and maybe taking other measures that come with their own sets of costs and benefits, perhaps trading off relatively more misinformation in exchange for a more free market in information, so to speak, a sort of a wilder but more free setup. That may be something that more people prefer. It all just comes down to personal preferences, basically. And so how that conversation plays out is going to have a bearing on how the deepfake technology is dealt with eventually. You know, that's all going to be one policy package, basically, once that's all sorted out. I don't think that conversation is anywhere near being completed, though, and it's barely being had by the broader public. It's more a niche thing that's being talked about more by people in policy and people who are interested in technology. But sooner or later, wider society is going to have a broader political discussion about that, and eventually we will have something resembling a consensus, or at least a set of consensuses by different political groups that will then compete politically to impose their preferred solution. But that's more medium term. But yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know about this issue in particular. I don't know about this particular story the person is referencing. But that's sort of the meta commentary on that issue that I could give.
It kind of generally ties into skepticism and being able to think about not just what's going on, but the motive for why it might be going on, and why they would present information in a certain way. It's tough stuff. It's hard to know who to trust, what information is the best, or made up.
Yeah, it's a thorny problem. You know, in general, skepticism is best, but a certain amount of trust is necessary for the functioning of a democratic political system. So it's particularly threatening for Western societies or Westernized societies that have democratic institutions. For now, it's probably still manageable, but it's only going to get worse over time as the technology improves, etc. So that is something that will have to be worked out one way or the other. Let's see, I'm looking through my notes here. I think the only thing I would say before I think we did have a few questions already, so, but before I get into that, I had a correction from the last time a couple weeks ago. The INF treaty that the United States pulled out of, announced that it was pulling out of, and that Russia was kind of sort of already pulling out of. Last week I kind of mischaracterized it a bit, so I just wanted to make it clear that the INF treaty only applied, or applies, to ground-based missiles. So I just wanted to put that out there. I don't quite remember the context of the original statement I made that was incorrect, but I had it in my notes here to make that correction. So everybody knows the INF treaty only applies to ground-based missiles specifically. I think it might have been I said it was range. I think it might have been that I said it was missiles above a specific range were not allowed by the treaty. In point of fact, missiles that are not ground-based can have any kind of range that they want under the treaty. So just making that clear for everybody so that nobody kind of walks away from that last week misinformed. I try to be accurate. I guess I could make the usual disclaimer.
I'm not an expert in everything I know. Gotcha.
Well, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about. You know, I have a stronger background in some areas than others. You know, I try to be as accurate as I can, but that's not always possible given my knowledge set. So I definitely encourage people in chat to participate, and you know, if I say anything that's wrong, incorrect, or biased, or you know, what have you, please do correct me in chat. You know, I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later, and so I'll see it eventually. And so, meant to be more participatory. It's meant to be conversational. I know I do most of the talking, but there's meant to be more of a give and take. I learn from chat, and you know, hopefully, you know, I talk about things that people get something out of as well. So that's kind of the ideal, anyway. But just wanted to make that clear. You know, I'm not what I say is not always the gospel truth. In fact, it's never the gospel truth. Always take my statements with some skepticism. It's meant, what we talk about is meant to be more of a jumping off point for learning about given issues. It's not meant to be the end all and be all. So, you know, don't walk away from any of these thinking that you know everything there is to know about a given topic that we go over. It's information, but not total information. Something like that. So let's see. I think the first question we had was... Wait, where are the questions today? Oh, here we go. I didn't realize how many we had. We got a fair bit. How are you doing today? And in general, Agent Smith, we in Shadow. I'm doing fine. I can't complain. You know, fat and lazy, so...
Well, if you need help complaining, you could probably outsource that.
That's true.
There are lots of people who are very good at complaining. And if they got paid to complain, well, they could probably complain about that too.
Fair point. Fair point. Let's see. Glad to see you back. Hope you're doing well. We'll be having a vote in Switzerland soon that could set Swiss law above international law. What are the pros and cons to allowing this, in your opinion? Is there legal precedent for this or similar in the U.S.? Or how does U.S. law relate to international regulation? Thank you. I haven't read anything about this vote in Switzerland, so I don't know much about it. It seems odd to have a vote on whether Swiss law would be above international law. The way international law generally works is that states get together and agree on a set of what will become international law, basically a common set of rules. And then they vote on them in their own countries and basically pass those rules into law within their own code of law. So it's not really the case that international law is passed by some international body and then imposed on anybody. Generally, most international law, such as it is adopted legally within member states. So if you don't agree with the given international law, you totally don't have to pass it in your own country, and then it is not then legally binding within your own legal system. So I'm not sure what's accomplished by voting to set Swiss law above international law. Hypothetically, if I'm understanding this correctly, international law, if accepted by Switzerland, would technically be Swiss law. I guess you could argue, again, I would have to read more about this because I'm not sure exactly what they're voting on. I'm just going off of what's described here in the question. But if you're voting to just say that Swiss law is overrides international law that has not been verified or passed by the Swiss legislature, that would seem to be redundant because that's already kind of assumed. You know, if you haven't ratified a given set of international laws, they should not apply beforehand. And if you have ratified them, then they're technically not just international law; they're also Swiss law. Again, there may be more context here that I'm missing, in which case I apologize. If, you know, this person could elaborate a bit on the question a bit in that regard, but beyond that, I don't know much. I don't know enough about the context to kind of know whether or not it's really a substantive vote or whether this is just another one of those superficial referendums that's meant to be more of a symbolic vote than a substantive legal change. What are the pros and cons to allowing this, in your opinion? I mean, again, It's not substantive in so much as what's important is ratification of international law. Again, if you ratify it, then it is your law, not just somebody else's vaguely defined international law. I would have to read more about the context of the vote to know how substantive legally it would be and what pros and cons there would be. Is there legal precedent for this or similar in the U.S.? Well, in the U.S., the U.S. attitude generally is very skeptical towards international law. The U.S. has signed international agreements to adopt international law in the past, but it generally does so only in so much as it can be justified as being in the national interest. And there's a fairly large body of political opinion in the United States that's very hostile to international law. I think Josh Bolton is sort of the spirit animal of that group. He got to live his. We talked a bit last week about he got to live his dream recently. I think last month when he got to bitch out and threaten the International Court of Justice. That's something he and his ilk have long wanted to do. So there's certainly a lot of opinion here that is not for international law, but I don't think anybody feels it necessary to pass a law explicitly stating that international law is subservient to U.S. law within the United States. I think that's kind of already the case. Legal precedent, how does U.S. law relate to international regulation? Pretty much already covered that. So I apologize if my answer isn't that all-encompassing there. Again, I would have to read more about the referendum itself to know more. But that is kind of my impression of how international law interacts with domestic law in individual countries. Again, if I ever give an answer that is not, and this goes for everybody, if I ever give an answer that is not particularly satisfactory or does not quite get to the crux of the question, or if I misunderstand the nature of the question, please do feel free to ask again, and I'll be happy to return to it. Now, let's see. Recently, 2 Reuters journalists were released from prison where they were detained for uncovering atrocities made by Myanmar army forces in the Rakhine State. The government decided to dismiss the charge of incitement. Why did the government decide not to go ahead with the case, and could this have any implications for freedom of speech outside of Myanmar? I think I remember reading about, I think this was the, oh no, I'm thinking of a different case, actually. So let's see, why did the government decide not to go ahead with the case? I don't know exactly, because the Burmese government tends to be pretty cagey on things like this. Keep in mind that the Burmese government, when it comes in Burma, sorry, I should say Myanmar, that's technically the name. In Myanmar, when it comes to national security issues, like the one that these Reuters journalists were involved in, it's not actually the government that handles prosecution, it's actually the military. The military still has basically sole responsibility over internal and external security affairs in Myanmar. And the Myanmar military is not a terribly transparent institution. It's very authoritarian and does not feel particularly obliged, legally or otherwise, to tip its hand, so to speak, to share the reasons that it does this, that, or the other. So it's not really clear why the journalists in question were released. You could say it was international pressure. Probably a significant factor was the fact that the journalists themselves were not citizens of Myanmar. I think they were foreign journalists. So the fact that they were released probably had to do with management of international relations. They probably didn't want to piss off their home countries too much. Given all of the international pressure over the whole, what are they called? Do you remember this, Neuro, the minority group that's been oppressed in Myanmar recently?
Nope.
Oh, hell. The name slips my mind all of a sudden. Myanmar. Rohingya, that's what it was. There's been a lot of international pressure that's been brought against the Myanmar government over the Rohingya issue. Mind you, they don't like calling them Rohingya in Myanmar. They consider that to be something that was enforced, is maybe not the best word. Well, basically, they don't think there's really any such thing as Rohingya. They think that's an innovated ethnicity. They think actually the people who call themselves Rohingya are actually just Bangladeshi illegal immigrants. Or at least that's what the Myanmar government says they believe anyway. But the Rohingya issue has been very problematic, suffice to say, for Myanmar's international relations. So it may be that they released the journalist in question just to try to avoid exacerbating that tension. I suspect that would probably have been a significant factor. That's not an unusual happenstance when it comes to authoritarian governments arresting foreign journalists. Egypt has been in that situation a couple of times over the past 10, 20 years. And generally, they end up releasing the journalists after maybe like a year of detaining them. They're not nearly so lenient when it comes to native journalists. There are still, I believe, a couple of Myanmar journalists who were arrested after printing some information that had been leaked from some sources in the Myanmar military, and they're still in prison and are probably going to remain there for some time. So that forbearance exhibited in their example has not been replicated for the foreign journalists, and this being referenced in this particular question. And as for whether it has any implications for freedom of speech outside of Myanmar, I'm not sure what's meant by that. I don't think anybody outside Myanmar really holds up Myanmar as a example of how to manage free speech policy, so I don't think anybody is really watching them with bated breath in that regard. As far as maybe pro-free speech institutions and outside of Myanmar, they may take an interest, but I don't think they really have any leverage that they can bring to bear against Myanmar as far as pushing them to be more open. So I don't think there's really any big implications outside Myanmar for free speech. You know, it's still, despite the fact that Myanmar has opened up over the past 10 years and democratized somewhat, it's still a relatively clannish, closed country, relatively speaking. You know, again, it's opened up a bit, but the military is not really comfortable with foreign criticism, and it still kind of manages its affairs with relative secrecy. Let's see, so then somebody else asked, the same person asked, how are the Muslim re-education camps going in China?
I did see headlines for that.
Yeah, that's still going on. We still don't know a whole lot about it. I think there was, I think I posted something on my Twitter account where there was basically a BBC article in which they detailed the actual evidence that there are quote-unquote re-education camps in Xinjiang. And I was surprised that the Chinese civil society kind of has produced a lot of that evidence. People in China have taken an interest and have kind of tried to skirt the censorship regime to try to find evidence and get it out of China. And some of the evidence is kind of first person, you know, you talk to people, you get first person accounts, etc. A lot of it is also satellite evidence, you know, satellite images of given institute, basically structures that have been built relatively recently. And then you kind of go to those locations and kind of inquire, oh, hey, what are you guys building? And, you know, invariably the government response is cagey. The Chinese government is actually not very good at lying. I suspect that's the result of not having to lie generally. When your political system is explicitly authoritarian, as China's is, you're not really used to managing public opinion in a deft way. You know, generally authoritarian regimes manage public opinion in rather heavy-handed ways. So when it comes to something like this, where they're kind of put in a position where they either have to lie or say no comment, generally it's kind of obvious that they're up to something. I imagine they'll get better at that with time, but for now, the Chinese government is still learning the art of public policy, or perhaps more accurately, public relations. So there's something going on there. There are, you know, I think the government has said that they're training centers, that they're centers that are used to train people in new skills. And the question then is why they're so big and why so many people are being held there for so long. And, you know, there must be one hell of a retraining regime. if they're holding them for as long as they are. But there's no obvious, there's no explicit evidence, per se, that they are explicit re-education camps.
This kind of ties into that skepticism we talked about before related to fake information and stuff, because the reason people have question marks above their head is kind of like, well, based on the track record here, this is a minority group and they're getting a very strange special treatment that seems too good to be true. Why do we have so many of these people getting so many free gifts of training of skills? That's wonderful, or it's terrible and you're using that as a cover-up, kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's suspicious, to put it mildly. And it corresponds with disappearances. You know, there's a lot of people have disappeared.
What if they're going to a magical land where everything is wonderful?
That would be lovely. I'm sure the Chinese government would make that argument itself. The centers are great. What are you complaining about? But the disappearances early on in the program were not sufficiently large to arouse significant suspicion. But at this point, it's a significant portion of the entire Uyghur population that's actually been sent to these camps. So the government is really not in a position to deny the problem in its entirety. They can't just say, nobody is disappearing. We don't know what you're talking about. Obviously, people are disappearing. You know, there's not that many Uyghurs in China. I think maybe it's like 10 million, maybe 20 million. And the number of people in the camps is 1 to 2 million, I think, something in that range. Mm-hmm. So it's a big chunk of the population. It's not something you can hide. You know, there are neighborhoods where they haven't been hollowed out, but, you know, when half the neighborhood is suddenly missing, people notice. So evidence like that is kind of circumstantial, but it all points in one direction. And the direction is that they're being held. It's not entirely clear also what's happening in the camps. We have some word about what happens there. It seems like they're trying to... I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but it seems like the government has a sinicization policy in effect, where they're trying to sinicize the Uyghur population. Some of it is political. You know, apparently they make them sing lots of pro-communist songs, and, you know, if you get something wrong, then they punish you. You know, they won't feed you. Something.
But those are the best songs, and everyone should want to sing them, right?
Again, that would be the policy of the Communist Party of China. That is certainly their attitude. Also, I think they make them memorize passages from communist literature.
But that's the best literature.
Have you considered working for the party, Neuro? You make an excellent spokesman. Yeah, that's... I think that's the case. Again, we don't have much information about just what it is they do there, but conditions are not great. Again, punishment is generally physical of one sort or another. There are stories about beatings. I think, though, it's more food that's used. You know, if you screw up, they'll just cut your food ration or maybe just not feed you at all. In general, the impression I get is that they just want... Because the government itself says that part of the campaign, not the retraining centers, quote-unquote, but there is a campaign, in effect, to try to fight what the government considers Islamism. Specifically Salafism, you know, the extremist Islamism. But the government has a very low bar for Islamist extremism. Basically, having a beard is enough to get you labeled as a radical, because that's seen as being an Islamist sort of thing to do. And so if you were seen with a beard, or if there's something on your phone that they think is suspicious, i.e. having almost anything to do with, you know, Islam or what have you, they'll bring you in. They'll bring you in for that. So it's very mild things that can get you arrested right now and brought into these camps for quote-unquote re-education. And the impression I get is that the methods they're using are not terribly effective. You know, the Chinese government seems to have some very naive views about how it is that people can be converted, so to speak. So I don't think the program is going to be very effective in the long run. More likely, they're just going to aggravate a broad swath of the population. It kind of reminds me of a campaign from a few years ago before all this started happening. There was a publicity campaign that was propagated by the Xinjiang government. And the government was concerned, because again, a very low bar for defining extremism, it was concerned by women, specifically female Uyghurs who were not showing their face in public because that's kind of a part of tradition in the region, or at least a part of Islamic culture in certain parts of the world that women don't show their face. So they wear veils or what have you. So the government didn't like that, basically, and so they started a campaign to try to encourage women not to do that, and they had these big billboards up that basically advertised that, your women are beautiful, they should show their faces in public and all this kind of thing, but none of it really addressed the cultural aspect, the idea that this is an individual decision rooted in local Islamic culture. And as a result, unsurprisingly, the program was not terribly effective, and they ended up leaning more on sticks than carrots and trying to get people to change their behavior. But a lot of the stuff is very superficial. It's how you act in public, how you look in public, that kind of thing. But the government is not really addressing the fact that a lot of it is kind of just cultural, it is just local in nature. And without kind of recognizing that aspect, I don't think any of this is going to be very successful, and it's probably just going to be immensely grating. It's going to be seen as grating and degrading on the part of the local Uyghur population.
Well, there's been a sort of similar push and pull in France, right? Where women who wear coverings of some kind, that's a cultural choice based on what is normal for them. But then in France, it's kind of like, well, but this is against what we stand for in terms of women's rights, so you shouldn't want to do this. So it's like your culture is wrong kind of thing. And I'm not really in a place to give a hard answer to that sort of question, but it is more of a global thing that's trying to be figured out, not just specific to this situation in China.
Yeah, it's a recurring phenomenon in several countries, and those countries that have very strong cultural identities, like China or like France, being particular examples, they tend to respond very negatively to what they perceive as challenges to their own culture. You could argue that Uyghur society and Xinjiang is not really a part of core Chinese culture, and that maybe they should do more to respect that local culture, but that's not really the Chinese attitude. In fact, the Chinese government argues that Uyghur culture itself is being quote-unquote poisoned by foreign Islamist influences, and that they're trying to protect Uyghur culture in a sense. This argument does not have wide currency, it would seem, amongst the broader Uyghur population, which kind of sees it as more as an overbearing attempt to denigrate the local culture and assimilate them into Sinitic culture. Sinitic culture being basically mainstream Chinese culture. In a sense, the Uyghurs see it more as colonialism than as being sort of a defense done on their part. I don't, again, kind of like the Tibetan case study, I don't think there's a whole lot anybody can kind of do about it right now. The area is thoroughly within the realm of Chinese sovereignty. And if anybody complains outside China, of course the Chinese government says, well, it's an internal matter. It's really none of your goddamn business. So you can't really penetrate that. The Chinese government itself is very strong within China, and of course internationally has a lot of economic heft. So there's not really much pressure that can be brought to bear. So whatever the Chinese government wants to do in Xinjiang, they're going to do. Basically, that's the takeaway. And there's not much anybody's going to do to change it. The big question at this point is how successful the program will be. And again, I'm skeptical. The Communist Party, not unlike many communist parties around the world, if not most colonial-style governments, has very naive, superficial views of what constitutes culture and how to proselytize culture. Really, the best way to change someone's culture is to make them prosperous. We've talked before about how economic change is the principal force for cultural change, or at least one of the dominant forces for cultural change. Generally, immigrants into an economically healthy society will assimilate into that society within 1 or 2 generations. That's been pretty consistently shown. But in cases like European empires overseas, or in the case of, say, China in Tibet or perhaps Xinjiang, Generally, the attitude taken is that cultural change has to be imposed legislatively, if not also by force. And generally, where that's been done, the results have been much more mixed. Certainly, the response has been very negative amongst the target population. So I'm pretty skeptical that they'll be able to really synthesize a big part of the Uyghur population. It might happen naturally, because the economy there is relatively healthy, but the trouble there is that there's a lot of discrimination against Uyghurs. A lot of the economic growth has occurred in areas that have been settled mostly by Han Chinese, people from outside Xinjiang. And most of the areas that are actually still ethnically Uyghur are kind of marginalized. They're still relatively poor. So it's not really clear that they'll be able to really participate in that economic growth, and the corresponding inequality could serve to exacerbate rather than ease tensions between Han and Uyghur populations in Xinjiang, as well as between Uyghurs and the Chinese government. It would probably be really smart if they would just allow more scope for Uyghur culture, to give them Uyghur education, etc. Well, give them education in the Uyghur language and, that kind of thing. And to give them more opportunities that do not require knowledge of Mandarin, of the Mandarin language, because Mandarin language skills amongst Uyghurs are middling at best, and that limits their opportunities. So if the government would kind of meet them halfway and give them some more opportunities in that vein, that would probably go a long way towards easing tensions. You could probably even still challenge their culture like they're doing and get away with it if you gave them more economic opportunities. But as is, the government's approach is very ham-fisted. It's not focused on economic opportunities. And in so much as it does offer economic opportunities to Uyghur, it's in the form of affirmative action. It kind of it gives special privileges to Uyghurs in employment practices.
So you're saying money first, propaganda later.
Yeah, that would be better.
Okay.
That would be better. Affirmative action can help, but it's a limited tool in what it can accomplish. And, you can see in every society that's implemented widespread affirmative action programs that there are tensions that are created by them. So it does help ease tension in so much as it addresses discrimination. But over the medium to long term, it starts to create new tensions by way of the majority population feeling itself slighted, feeling itself discriminated against. So it's not really a good tool over the long run. But the Chinese government is leaning really hard on it to try to kind of even the playing field, and that's not going to work. You're going to need a broader set of policy approaches to the problem than just affirmative action if they really want to help the Uyghurs. And they're just not doing that. Again, it's affirmative action in one hand and then re-education camps in the other. So I don't think it'll work, but maybe it will. Who's to say? For now, though, I don't think it's a stretch to say that there's going to be some long-running tensions created on account of the current policy. But roughly, that's what we know about the re-education camps and how they're doing, so to speak. Let's see. If humanity were pushed to the edge of extinction from a Zerg invasion or any alien invasion, a la XCOM, what countries would withstand and how would their respective infrastructures play a role? Hypothetical question. Well, it would really depend on a lot of...
Didn't Japan fend off Godzilla for a really long time? They'd probably do okay.
No, not at all.
Oh, they didn't?
Not at all. That's every Godzilla movie ever, is the Japanese military trying and failing to stop Godzilla. So no, definitely did not. I mean, it just depends on a lot of variables, like how powerful are the aliens? I mean, there was a television series way back in the 90s that was explicitly about, I guess it wasn't an alien invasion, it was more of an alien migration. Remember the name of it. But those aliens were not in good shape. They were kind of poor and just needed a place to stay and, that kind of thing. So that's much more manageable type of
District 9?
No, that's a movie.
Oh.
Although that is very similar, kind of a similar idea. This was a television series in the mid-90s. And, Alien Nation, something like that. It was something. The aliens weren't really aliens. They were just guys that had, like, some spots painted on their sides. It wasn't very convincing alien makeup.
It's very half-assed.
It was, yeah, but it was a TV show, so, limited budget, basically. You can only do so much. On the other hand, if the aliens are just like, ascended aliens, if they're like an ascended race with hyper-powerful godlike technology, then no. No, nobody is going to do well against them. They're probably just going to breeze in and take over.
But what about America's can-do attitude?
Well,
have you not
with
seen
the can-do
Independence Day,
attitude,
dude?
I mean, against hyper-powerful aliens, it's not going to matter. You can die with style, where others would just die. That's the most you could say.
That doesn't sound very can-do to me. Are you even American, dude?
Well, maybe you could do something if the aliens were not so hyper-powerful.
Okay.
Or maybe you could get lucky with some War of the Worlds Deus Ex Machina and have them all die of a cold or some such nonsense.
Yeah.
But beyond that, yeah, it just depends on how powerful the aliens are. In general, I guess you could infer that those societies that have more technologically advanced, more powerful militaries will fare better.
What if we sent in both Will Smith and Jeff Goldblum at the same time?
Well, I mean, if they can turn you into a pile of random particles just by looking at you, it's not going to help.
I mean, they specifically said Protoss and Zerg, so we have a little bit of information on those two things.
Oh, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. From a Zerg invasion. Okay.
Yeah.
Or A-Law XCOM.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's more manageable. In that sense, yeah, then it would be just... Even then, though, it would just be the countries that had the more powerful militaries that would just do better. Because I don't think there's a whole lot the Central African Republic is going to be able to contribute to the resistance. No offense if you live in Car, but you got your own problems to deal with.
I would also say, if you're watching from Central African Republic, hello, welcome. That's awesome.
I don't think I've ever seen anybody from Africa in our little handy-dandy country chart.
South Africa has a few people quite often.
Ah, that's true. That's true. There is South Africa.
They don't always make
Besides
the list,
South
but
Africa.
they say hi pretty often.
Other than South Africa, I don't think I've ever seen anybody else. I suspect if you did, it would probably be Nigerian.
Egypt comes up reasonably often, too.
Oh, okay. Technically an African country.
Are you saying they don't count?
Well, I mean, North Africa is very, very distinct from
Yeah.
the rest of Africa.
Yeah, but you said Africa, it's a continent.
That's true. Fair point. I should be more accurate.
Did you
I
mean
should
to say sub-Saharan Africa? That seems like that's what you meant to say.
that was more the gist of what I meant.
Okay.
Sub-Saharan Africa, as opposed to the North Africa. North Africa generally kind of gets thrown in with the Middle East. The Middle East and North Africa, because
Yeah.
they all have the similar...
It's Arabic.
They're all
culture.
Arabic, yeah.
Yeah.
They're all culturally Arabic. Some more than others. Morocco and Algeria are kind of more influenced by Berber culture, I think. Maybe not Berber. What's the other one? There are two big nomadic cultures that originate in the Sahara Desert. Berbers are one, and then there's another one that slips my mind. Regardless, basically nomadic culture kind of is a bigger influence on northwestern African culture than sort of Egypt and Libya. There's more nomadic influence there rather than Arabic influence. But all of that is very different from sub-Saharan Africa, which has its own sort of thing going on, culturally speaking. It's mostly Bantu there, I think. Yeah, Africa's not my bag. I need to read more about African culture. But I do know that a lot of it is Bantu in sub-Saharan Africa. How did we get... Oh, XCOM, right.
How did we get to this? Oh yeah, XCOM.
Yeah, it's exactly what you would expect. It's very intuitive, I think. Just more powerful, bigger economy, bigger military. All of the countries you would expect to have more.
Bigger guns, kill more aliens, America.
Yeah.
Got 'em.
As for how their respective infrastructures would play a role, I don't know. I mean, better infrastructure is part of what makes an economy more successful, and having a successful economy is part of what allows you to have a more technologically advanced, larger, more powerful military. So, in that sense, infrastructure plays an indirect role. There's a more direct military role in so much as infrastructure allows you to redeploy more quickly to different areas, so there's kind of a strategic element there. I don't know that it would play much role beyond that, though, especially if the aliens destroy all your infrastructure. A lot of these alien invasions and games kind of portray the aliens as not really taking a particularly strategic approach to conquering Earth. They kind of just invade arbitrarily and then fight wherever.
Sounds like Zerg. Swarm them.
True.
Throw bugs in the base.
Well, even Zergs have cerebrates. You know, they do take a strategic approach. Right?
Maybe you do.
Fair point. Yeah, it just depends on the nature of the invasion. But generally, aliens are not portrayed as targeting infrastructure or industry or what have you. They generally just take on the military wherever and try to bludgeon them into submission. If they were smarter aliens, they would target the infrastructure. That would make things a lot more difficult. Let's see. I believe the faked video mentioned earlier was actually a reference to the doctored video sent out by Sarah Sanders concerning the incident with Jim Acosta during the presidential press conference, which resulted in Acosta's press pass being revoked. What are your thoughts on the White House's decision to strip Acosta's pass, CNN lawsuit to reinstate Acosta, and the ruling that was handed down? My impression of it is that the whole thing was a horse and pony show. Now, I think I had a... actually, I don't know if I posted that or not. Well, anyway, basically there was a journalist who posted an editorial commenting on that whole series of events, and their impression of it was that it was not really that serious. You know, basically Acosta was kind of grandstanding a bit, and the administration has kind of gone along with it. It's more for show than anything. You know, you can say that the White House is trying to inhibit free speech, but Acosta was kind of out of line a bit in what he was doing. But the government didn't have to come down on him as hard as they did either. So basically they're playing off each other. The media makes money off of the Trump administration's antics. So if the media sometimes kind of goads the administration unnecessarily, trying to kind of get that, you know, headline-worthy reaction, and the administration in turn gets a lot of political points amongst its base when it cracks down on journalists for whatever reason or another. So this is more theater than it is substantive politics. It's not really free speech coming under threat or journalism being pushed, you know, journalists being targeted for, you know, challenging the powers that be. It's more just egos in competition with each other. So I don't invest too much into the whole Acosta affair. I don't read too much into it. I don't think it's really a big indicator of the Trump administration's policies and attitude towards the media. Their attitude towards the media is very negative, and there's certainly a problem with that. But the Acosta case is not really an example in point. Nor, for that matter, do I think Acosta was being entirely unreasonable. I don't think he was being an explicit asshole. I think he was just being a journalist. So I don't think it's really fair to strip him of his credentials for that. But that is kind of in the pattern of the Trump administration, kind of blowing things out of proportion and making a mountain out of a molehill. So nobody's innocent, but I don't really think it's the end of the republic either. Oh, the lawsuit is just kind of part of that. The CNN lawsuit to reinstate Acosta. I wasn't really sure what that was predicated on. I need to read more about that. I would think that the administration, whatever administration may be, would have discretion in who it gives press credentials to. So I'm not sure what law they're violating by denying him credentials. I would think that would be a pretty subjective, informal process. But I don't think the victory in the lawsuit, such as it is any great victory for free speech and journalism either. We'll see. We'll see what comes of it, but I don't think it's any big deal, so to speak. I just don't think too much of it. Let's see. The Trump administration a few weeks ago pulled us from the INF treaty, accusing Russia of building and/or testing nuclear missiles that were previously banned. Although no actual evidence of Russia testing nuclear weapons recently has appeared, it makes one wonder if this is more of a political posturing thing, or is there indication that Russia may be helping North Korea with their ICBM nuclear project? Have you any insight on this? Let's see. Russia has not been testing nuclear weapons, but they have been testing missiles that could have nuclear warheads, that could be equipped with nuclear warheads. And the missiles themselves are in breach of the treaty because they are ground-based missiles with a range beyond, 200, 300 miles, whatever the range restriction in the treaty was. So technically they are in violation of the treaty. The Russians say they're not, but there is pretty substantive evidence that they have been developing missiles to that effect in violation of the treaty. So I don't think that there's any question that there's any real question that Russia is in violation of the treaty. The question is, what do you do about it? And previous administrations, specifically the Obama administration, had taken the attitude that they would kind of let it slide because they didn't really care that much. We'll bring some pressure on them, but we'll just kind of negotiate it over the long run, and then whatever. I mean, the United States, being out of the treaty, can develop now ground-launched missiles beyond, X range, whatever the range limit was, but really the United States has no desire to do that because most of the missiles that the U.S. uses are air-launched or ship-launched. So it's no great gain strategically for the United States to leave the treaty. So, Russia basically kind of voided the treaty de facto, in effect, when it started experimenting on the new missiles. And since then, the U.S. has figured, well, better to keep the treaty in effect, so at least we could try to negotiate a Russian return to the treaty than to leave the treaty entirely and to have to renegotiate a new treaty from scratch in future. But in effect, the treaty has been kind of null and void for years, since the Russians started testing the new missiles during the period of the Obama administration. So it's not any great loss for the United States, but in general it would be better if everybody could kind of agree on that, since arms control treaties are a net benefit for not just the United States and Russia, but for everybody. So having an arms control regime in place that extends to nuclear missiles or missiles that could be used as nuclear missiles is kind of the ideal, if only in the abstract. So, yes, the Trump administration leaving the treaty is more about posturing, because again, the US didn't really care anyway. It kind of already recognized the treaty as being void. In that sense, it is more about posturing. Is there indication that Russia may be helping North Korea with their... I don't think there's any evidence of that. I don't think Russia gets anything out of helping North Korea with their nuclear program. I think Russia and China, for that matter, would rather North Korea not have a nuclear program. So it's more trouble than it's worth in that sense. I mean, hypothetically, the North Koreans could give them something, could pay them, or trade them something. But I don't think North Korea really has anything that Russia really wants that they could trade for that kind of support. Russia would much rather its neighbors be quiet. They would much rather North Korea in particular to be just a quiet, normal country that they could do business with. Having an unstable, small country with nuclear weapons on your border is nobody's desire, including Russia. So I don't think they're helping them out. You could argue that they're kind of letting it slide, that they could do more to try to push the North Koreans to give the program up. That could well be the case. It may be that the Russian government is kind of willing to not bring as much pressure to bear as they could in exchange for maintaining economic ties. That may be a strategic consideration, or it may just be cynicism on the part of the Russian government. They may just not think that the North Korean government can really be made to give up their nuclear weapons by that form of pressure. So in that sense, it could just be the Russians, and from their perspective, being quote-unquote realistic, taking a more realistic approach where you just kind of accept that they have nuclear weapons, apply some pressure to encourage them to get rid of them, but otherwise carry on as normal. I suspect that would probably be more the Russian position, if indeed that is sort of what they're doing, if indeed they are kind of taking a slack approach to pressuring North Korea. That as opposed to encouraging North Korea to have nuclear weapons so that they can, I don't know, pressure the United States or what have you. Let's see, how long do you do the segment? I don't know, what, we generally do this for an hour or two?
Usually 2 to 3.
Usually 2 to 3?
Yeah, but okay. Time flies when you're breaking down what's happening in the world. And you chase some tangents for a little bit, you know?
Yeah, quite a bit. Well, somebody was asking, how long after you do the segment do you go back and read the chat? I read all of the chat. Sometimes it takes me a couple days, but sometimes, you know, if I'm feeling particularly spry, I might sit down right after and read through all of it. That's generally not a good idea, though, because that can take me up until 5 a.m. in the morning. But yeah, generally I read it right after. Would love to answer. And you can always email me, too. You know, if you really want to send information directly, my email is out there. So I should probably remember it. What is it? johntx1848@gmail.com. I think that's what it is. So if you want to email me and, you know, share some information or talk or tell me what a shithead I am, whatever you like, there's the email. johntx1848@gmail.com. So
is that in the who is it command? Because that would be a good thing to add. Well, I can figure that out. You don't have to worry about that right now.
Oh, okay.
It's not, so we can add that for the future.
But that's out there for people who want to give feedback more directly than indirectly through chat, if they prefer. Let's see. On the Saudi subject, what do you think of Erdogan, who revealed the tapes in good faith, but continues to be sort of an asshole? Quote unquote. That's the question. Namely, with Greece and trespassing the Greek water border. What do I think of Erdogan? Well, what do I think of Erdogan is a question in and of itself. I mean, my own opinion isn't that relevant. Nobody cares what my opinion on the subject. But in general, my impression of Erdogan is that he's more authoritarian, that he kind of wants to centralize power in Turkey. I'm not really sure why. You know, generally people who are authoritarians at heart and who want to lead, to be the leader, have something in mind that they want to do. It's not always power for the sake of power. You know, Stalin was a hard leftist who wanted to implement a far left agenda, for example. So Erdogan has given hints that he's kind of a neo-Ottoman at heart, that he kind of wants to make wants to make Turkey, rather, more conservative, wants to kind of roll back the clock. You know, Turkey's culture was changed, or at least to a degree, was impacted, let's say, by the secular nationalist Kemalist movement. Basically, that movement tried to make Turkey more secular and to try to mitigate the role of Islam in Turkish culture. It was part of a modernization program. So a lot of conservative Muslims in Turkey have long chafed under that regime. You know, authoritarian secular regimes have ruled Turkey basically from roughly the end of World War I up until the 1990s, when democratic elections were allowed, basically. And since then, moderate Islamists like Erdogan have kind of won those elections, and their ideal is to kind of roll back some of the restrictions that the secular authoritarians had implemented and to allow Islam to have more scope in Turkish society and culture. But Erdogan has also kind of indicated that he kind of has a thing for the Ottoman Empire, so he might want to, so it seems like he might, if he gets enough power, try to maybe not undo all of the secular changes wrought by Ataturk, but maybe a lot of them. You know, maybe. It's not clear. Again, it's still early days. He's not dictator of Turkey yet. He's just got a lot of power concentrated in his office. So it's not inevitable that he'll try to recreate the Ottoman Empire, but that might be the direction he tries to go in. There's just not enough evidence yet to kind of see just what his vision is for Turkey, beyond just social conservatism. I should point out that social conservatism is not the only plank in the AKP's party platform. Erdogan and his political party also embrace free market economics, basically. They're considered a pro-business political party. So there's also that angle, but it's as they've accrued more political power, they've kind of embraced more and more the social conservative side of their political platform. We'll see what comes of that. Part of what made them popular was economic growth and the expansion of economic opportunities that were brought by embracing free market policies. But as the Turkish economy kind of wanes a bit, it may be that the social conservative side of the political platform is not enough to continue to get the AKP the votes they need to continue to be to continue to monopolize political power in Turkey. We've talked a bit about that before. That's kind of an open question. We'll see what happens. Namely with Greece. So Erdogan's position with Greece is that he doesn't really care about Greece. I suspect that to be true. I know that there's been some tensions with some border shenanigans of one sort or another, but I think the recent examples of that occurred just before the most recent Turkish election. And I think it was just a part of electioneering on the part of Erdogan and the AKP. I don't think they really care about, this, that, or the other island in the Aegean Sea. Actually, that's not the Aegean Sea, is it? Well, whatever. You know what I mean. I don't really think anybody but the most extreme Turkish nationalists really gives a shit about disputed islands with Greece. I think it only really comes up during elections when political parties are trying to get votes, and they're trying to they take symbolic actions to try to prove that they're nationalistic.
I think you can broaden that point to just any country. I don't think anyone except nationalists is going to care about disputed islands that have nothing on them.
Yeah, pretty true. I suspect your statement would be accurate.
But these are our islands, and that's why they're important.
Yeah. But with regard to Greece, I don't think Erdogan is really that interested. I wouldn't worry about it, basically. If you're Greek, and you're concerned that the Turks are coming for your disputed islands, I wouldn't worry about it. I think they're only going to take symbolic actions to claim them during elections, and other than that, they'll probably just forget about them once the elections are over. There's a long-running tension between Greece and Turkey. Partly it's historical and cultural. The Ottoman Empire conquered Greece and subjugated the population. There were sundry atrocities, and there was the ritual, not ritual, but there was a custom wherein the Ottoman government would take the firstborn sons, I think, of Christian families and take them from the families and raise them to be Muslims and raise them as soldiers and bureaucrats. There was a specific name for that system, but I don't remember what it was. I think the soldiers were called janissaries, if I'm remembering correctly. But obviously that was not a particularly popular policy amongst the Christian subjects of the Ottoman Empire. Although in some cases it was embraced. Because here's the thing, if you lived in the Balkans, mostly it was the Balkans, if you were a Christian in the Balkans, you were then probably pretty poor. It was pretty rural. It had been devastated by wars, mostly when the Ottomans had come through and conquered them, so you were probably facing pretty dire circumstances in most of the Balkans at the time. So the possibility that your son would go on to be raised, basically go on to be educated and serve as a bureaucrat in the upper echelons of the Ottoman government, that's probably a better fate than they were facing if they'd been allowed to stay with you. So there were some families that actually were excited and happy that their children were selected for that. But again, that's not everybody. There were plenty that were not, did not like that. And certainly nationalists in the region resented it greatly. But once there was tension, basically the point I'm getting at is that there was tension between Turks and Greeks on account of policies of the Ottoman Empire. And then it got worse because of World War I. Well, I shouldn't say World War I per se, but But after the war, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and as part of the treaty that ended World War I, Greece was actually supposed to get the western part of Turkey, because that's the part of Turkey that had a lot of ethnic Greek people. So that was supposed to go to Greece, but then the Turkish War of Independence, as it's called, occurred, in which Turkish nationalists, led by Ataturk himself, formed an army and basically ejected the foreigners, foreign armies, and the Greeks in particular. And the result of that was a massive ethnic cleansing, in which a good chunk of the ethnic Greek population in Turkey, specifically Western Turkey, was ejected from the Anatolian Peninsula and pushed out to Greece. And ethnic Turks, in turn, were pushed out of Greece into Turkey, and the result was a lot of violence, a lot of unrest. The uprooting of mass populations is never a clean, happy process. It's always immensely disruptive, and there's generally a lot of violence and exploitation involved. So that particular episode itself contributed significantly to ethnic tension between Turks and Greeks, above and beyond just the historical tension between them. And since then, there's been a lot of tension regarding, territory, basically, because the demarcation of boundaries between Greece and Turkey has always been a little cagey in certain areas, specifically islands. So that nationalist disputes about the islands sometimes flare up, and nationalists get all excited about it, so that turns into a political issue, because generally political parties feel obliged to humor, at least, nationalist sentiments in their countries. So then they have to go and make these symbolic gestures to appease the nationalists. Generally, they don't go anywhere, but there's when they happen, people kind of have to ask the question, oh, is this going to result in a conflict? No, not generally. Generally, it's just symbolic. But tensions get heated enough that people are a little bit concerned. So I suspect that the island dispute with the actions taken by the Turkish government recently with regard to Greece's islands, or the disputed islands, let's call them, with Greece, probably fall into that category. A temporary crisis sparked by political circumstances that blows over very quickly. Let's see, does Smith have any opinions about the Falun Gong issue in China? I can't say that I do. I don't really have strong opinions one way or the other on it. I don't know a whole lot about the Falun Gong. They were, for those who are not familiar with the Falun Gong, they were a sect, a kind of, well, some would say religious movement, a kind of new religion. Others would say cult. What you call it kind of depends on your perspective. That itself kind of says something about how you view them. They emerged, I want to say, in the 1990s in China, but they grew very quickly in popularity. I think the gist, there were like a lot of philosophies that emerge in China. They're kind of spiritual, and they focus on honing the body, rituals. I think exercising in the morning was one of the things they were known for. And I don't know enough about the philosophical tenets to really get in depth on that aspect, but I know morning exercise is something they're associated with, and they spread rapidly amongst a good chunk of the population. And for a long time, the Chinese government kind of let it slide, kind of tolerant of them, kind of do your thing. But eventually, the party got concerned by how popular they were getting, and what happened was they took some measures to kind of curb their spread. And the Falun Gong responded by organizing a mass protest in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. And they mobilized a lot of people. It wasn't just a minor protest. Like, they filled out that square with Falun Gong followers. And after that, the government response was extremely negative. As you can imagine, the Communist Party of China does not like being challenged like that. And so their attitude after the fact was to basically ban the Falun Gong. And since then, they've been an underground religion, basically. They're not, and the government goes out of its way to paint them as being a cult, and that they exploit their followers, and that it's all about money and what have you. And there's probably some truth to that. There's always some truth to that with regard to underground movements like that, but it's probably also exaggerated to a degree as well. The movement actually has met some success overseas. So outside of China, they don't face nearly the same restriction. So they do kind of carry on their activities outside of China, but in China they still exist, but in a much curtailed form. They cannot operate openly. But I don't really have explicit opinions about it. It's just an example, for me, it's just an example of the Chinese government's paranoia. They really do not like movements that they do not explicitly control. If you want an example of that, you can look at the long-running negotiations between the Chinese government and the Vatican. The Vatican wants to have exclusive powers to appoint officials within the Catholic hierarchy in China, as they do in elsewhere, but the Chinese government is not comfortable with that because that's an example of an outside power having control of their own affairs, which the party cannot abide, basically. So the party will allow Catholicism in China, but it wants the Catholic hierarchy to either be appointed by Communist Party officials or to be at least consented to by the Communist Party. And that seems to be the agreement that they've reached. I think there is some consensus there. They've moved forward with an agreement whereby the Catholic Church will nominate officials, and then the Communist Party, I think, will clear them. I might be mixing that up. Maybe the party nominates them? One or the other. Basically, somebody nominates, and then the other party ratifies, accepts them. So the party has a de facto veto one way or the other, and that's what's important for the party. But the Falun Gong, they don't trust at all. Like with the Catholic Church, they trust somewhat, because the Catholic Church's organization chart is a lot more hierarchical. It's kind of easier to see where the moving parts are. So being a more formal institution, it's easier to control and easier to monitor. So the party is a little more comfortable with that. But the Falun Gong don't have that level of organization. And given that they took an explicit stand against the party, well, not explicit, but even implicit, that puts them on the Communist Party's permanent shit list. So that's an example of the party's attitude towards religion. You can be an open religion and operate openly, that's all good and well, just so long as you don't challenge the party and so long as the party has some means of monitoring and controlling your religion's institutions. As a side note, there's a YouTube channel called, I think it's called China Uncensored. And they do videos on commenting on Chinese politics, culture, society, what have you. That's actually funded by the Falun Gong. I don't know if people are aware of that. So it does have something of a bias. The channel does kind of have an editorial bias in so much as it is kind of pro-Falun Gong and a little bit anti-Communist Party. It's a decent channel in so much as it produces regularly. It's got decent production values, and they do talk about stuff that you just can't hear about elsewhere. There's not a lot of places you can go to get regular news and commentary about China. So China Uncensored is a nice source in that regard, but do keep in mind it does have that bias.
Well, this is a case in the example of the question people ask a lot, which is, which news can we get that's unbiased? And it's kind of like everyone has their own bias. You should know what the bias is and basically factor that in whenever you're browsing their material.
Mm-hmm. So there was a subpart to this question. Also wanted to touch upon the Falun Gong organ harvesting thing perpetrated by the Chinese government. So for those not familiar with this, the Chinese government has at various times been accused of harvesting the organs of prisoners. And and the allegations also encompass Falun Gong. They say that they're harvesting people they arrest for being members of the Falun Gong. But in general, it's not just Falun Gong, it's also prisoners writ large that the accusations apply to. And nobody's ever been able to prove it explicitly. It is still just an allegation, but it's been a pretty persistent one. Supposedly prisoners basically are executed and then their organs harvested and given to party officials who are in need of them. Again, no hard, fast evidence on that, so it's still just an allegation at this point. You can't prove it, but you also kind of can't disprove it because China's institutions are opaque. That's the downside. One of the many downsides of having an opaque authoritarian political system is that you have virtually no plausible deniability on anything. Anybody who accuses you of something, anybody can accuse you of virtually anything, and you would be very hard-pressed to dispel those accusations. In a more open political system, you kind of have checks and balances, you have more transparency, you have a better reputation, so you have means by which to dispel false accusations. It's easier to do in a place like the West, the United States, etc. But with an authoritarian system, nobody trusts anybody, really. Nobody trusts the government in particular. So pretty much all allegations have some merit to them, in so much as that they could be true. So that puts the government in a difficult spot. That's one of the reasons authoritarian governments go so far out of their way to crack down on rumors. Because rumors are uncontrollable. Some of them could be true, but a lot of them probably are not. Either way, they all have equal credibility, and that creates a weak spot in terms of the government's legitimacy, because it makes it very easy to spread rumors that discredit the government. Anyway, that's kind of meta. That's what do I think about? Touch upon. Well, basically, that's touching upon the issue in question. There's no hard proof that it's happening, and it's not. If it is happening, it's probably not just the Falun Gong. The allegations also encompass just prisoners in general. It may be that they do it with prisoners who are set to be executed. That could be true. It may be that it's not just anybody who's arrested and goes to prison could be executed and have their organs harvested. It may be that they just take people on death row and after they've been executed, maybe harvest them. That wouldn't surprise me, because I don't think that would be nearly as controversial as just arbitrarily harvesting the organs of political prisoners, which obviously would be much more controversial, to put it mildly. But again, without the institution in question being transparent, it's impossible to tell one way or the other. The government itself denies it, but they would deny it, so that doesn't really prove anything. Let's see, what do I think of the US's role in the Middle East after all these years? There's different ways you could interpret that question. I guess I'll take a functionalist approach. So the function that the US takes, the function of the US role in the Middle East is basically as arbiter and protector. It's a security guarantor for its allies in the region, and its nominal role is to make sure that nobody dominates the region. Well, nobody else dominates the region.
Okay.
That's basically the U.S. role in a nutshell, and that's more or less how U.S. foreign policy in the region is designed. Obviously, the U.S. deviated from that a bit in invading Iraq. I'm not quite sure what the hell the original justification was for that. Obviously, there was a public justification, but I'm not sure what the internal logic used in the administration was. You know, what the U.S. motivation was for the Iraq war is something that people can debate for, hours and hours on. So I won't get into that. That's a rabbit hole. But that was a deviation from the norm. Generally, the U.S. took a more laid-back approach. Generally you had to invade another country in the region to get U.S. attention. A-Law, the first Gulf War. The U.S. kind of taking a more proactive role in launching what the government called a quote-unquote preemptive war was a bit ambitious on their part. And since then, the U.S. has returned to its more traditional role of just making sure everybody behaves themselves. That's one of the reasons that the United States is always at odds with the Iranian government, because the Iranian government does not really color within its lines, so to speak. They go out and try to influence the politics in neighboring states. They support Hezbollah. They have a very particular opinion on the state of Israel and its quote-unquote right to exist, which is not really in line with U.S. policy. So basically, there's a sense that the Iranian government is not willing to live and let live, that they're taking an active role in destabilizing their neighbors, and that necessitates a response by the U.S. government as security guarantor for the region. So that's nominally the reason that the U.S. does the things it does in the region, and that's sort of the functionalist explanation for the U.S. role in the region. Obviously, you can get more detailed. You could argue that there's specific U.S. interests in the region that it specifically wants to defend, oil interests being predominant among them. In fact, that's probably the only one, really. There's some political affinity for Israel and its, existence, basically. So there is some desire to try to help Israel survive. But I don't think that's a core interest for the United States. I think that's more of a quid pro quo. Basically, the United States helps Israel, and in return, the Israelis help the United States in its sundry security operations. Basically, it's policy in the region. Israel supports U.S. foreign policy in the region, and in return, the U.S. throws them a bone when they need it. The oil sector, you know, the oil interests are probably the principal interests. Keep in mind, the Arab oil-producing nations embargoed the West, not just the United States, but the West in general, in response to the Yom Kippur War, 1973, and the result was an immense amount of economic disruption for Western economies. So the idea that oil interests as a result are considered very important. Basically, ever since then, the United States in particular has taken a very particular interest in making sure that nothing like that ever happens again. So it's not just the United States government protecting the profits of the oil industries, of the oil companies rather, although that is part of it. But there is a broader strategic interest at stake as far as making sure that relations with Arab countries do not become so bad that they can basically economically attack, so to speak, the United States and the West. Foreign policy in the region is also geared towards ensuring that if relations with the Arab countries did become sufficiently bad that they would want to embargo, that they did not, that there was sufficient U.S. political, military, economic pressure that they were deterred from doing so. So the U.S. position in the Middle East goes beyond just being a security guarantor towards ensuring its own interest vis-a-vis economic interests. There's also a desire to cooperate on political things like basically security, counterterrorism being the principal case. Whatever tensions there are between the United States and Saudi Arabia, it would certainly not behoove the United States to see the Saudi government collapse and be replaced with a Salafist regime that was explicitly anti-American and wanted to use Saudi Arabia's oil resources to fund sundry terrorist activities or other strategic challenges, if you will, against American interests in the region. So to a degree, helping out the regimes in place is a quid pro quo that helps American interests and regional interests as far as avoiding that outcome. So that's some quick points as far as the U.S. role in the region. If there's some other element you want me to get to, or if there's something you think I missed, please do comment, because I feel like I'm missing something. So please do elaborate on that question. If this person who asked this question wants to elaborate and kind of point something out that I'm missing, please do. Because I get that feeling in the back of my head that there's something I'm missing.
Well, the thing that I had gathered from watching a lot of documentaries and stuff is that America is no longer in a primary fighting role, but they have a pretty stable training role still. Where the people who are actually local to the region, who are invested in the conflict because they're neighbors to the conflict, they're the ones who are developing the skills to be able to fight the bad guys and defend the good guys, that kind of thing, from whomever's perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point. In general, one of the trends in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has been to, as the Obama administration was somewhat lampooned for, quote-unquote, leading from behind. The U.S. had, obviously, under the first Bush administration, well, not the first, the second Bush administration, took a very forward, aggressive approach to managing regional affairs. And since then, the U.S. has kind of stood back and taken a less aggressive, direct approach. It's been much more indirect. And the Obama administration pushed regional allies to take greater initiative in handling their affairs. In fact, one of the big reasons that Saudi Arabia today is so much more active in the region, in other words, you know, for example, fighting the war in Yemen, supporting rebels in Syria, assassinating Khashoggi, you know, all of that stuff. One of the reasons that's happened is because years ago, under the Obama administration, there was a push to empower regional allies to take more responsibilities, specifically so that the U.S. would not have to. Basically, the idea was shift the burden of regional security onto regional actors. So the U.S. was more of a last-ditch security guarantor, rather than being an explicit manager and interfering directly into affairs of the region. The U.S. would kind of sit back and say, okay, you guys manage your own stuff, and we'll only intervene if things get really bad. That was sort of the approach of the Obama administration, and it's kind of still the approach of the Trump administration. You know, the Trump administration has made a lot of noise about challenging Iran and you know, doing more in Syria, but that was more about, you know, in the Syrian example, that was more about targeting the Islamic State. And with the case of Iran, that's actually what the Saudis want. You know, the Saudi government, in managing regional affairs and taking on a more prominent role, has explicitly targeted Iran because they see them as an explicit rival. You know, even before the U.S. started drawing down in the region, the Saudis have been begging the U.S. to do more. And when the U.S. started giving them a more free hand, the first thing they did was basically start going after Iran. So yes, the Trump administration has been more active vis-a-vis Iran, but they've mostly been doing it more or less at the behest of the Saudi government. They haven't done anything as far as Iran policy that the Saudis have been against. Let's put it like that. So there is a definitive trend towards drawing down and taking a more sort of mild approach to the region. Oh, what's the phrase I want? Offshore balancing. That's the phrase they use in the in the international relations literature. The idea of offshore balancing is that you balance the powers in a region to make sure none of them can take over the region. So in that way, none of them really becomes a threat to your interest. So that's more the approach the United States has been taking, although it hasn't really been balancing against Iran, so that's not quite entirely accurate. But the style that the U.S. has taken more resembles offshore balancing than the previous tack that they'd taken, which was much more direct. Let's see. What do you know of current political situation of Poland and government standing with its own citizens in the European Union? Let me take a big drink of water, because this is going to take a while. Okay. So, I think, I'm trying to remember when the election happened. Basically, since the Cold War ended and since Poland started integrating with the West, the dominant political parties have been principally center-right. In general, they've been pretty liberal. They've embraced democracy. They embraced free market reforms. They basically did everything that the European Union asked them to do. So there have been a lot of reforms in Poland over the past 20 years, 20, 30 years. I guess it's been more 30 years now. So that was all good and well. You know, there was some political shifts between left-wing parties and right-wing parties, but everybody was pretty centrist and everybody was pretty on board with reforming the political system to be more liberal democratic and having economic management be principally liberal in nature. So what happened is that a couple of years ago, it's relatively recently, but I'm blanking out on the exact date. I'm sure somebody in chat can kind of clear that up, but there was a specific election in which the Law and Justice Party won power. And the Law and Justice Party is not a far-right party. It's been accused of being a far-right party, but that's not entirely fair. It's more just right-wing. It's a conservative right-wing party, and they won power in part on the back of concerns about identity that kind of came about because of the immigration crisis in Europe from a few years ago. And they were also concerned that the European Union was becoming too imperious. They didn't like that the European Union was criticizing nations for not being sufficiently liberal, specifically Hungary. Hungary was the case. Poland and Hungary, for those who don't know, have this weird historical bromance. Like, I don't really know the history behind it, but for whatever reason, there's a lot of affinity between people in Poland and Hungary. It's kind of this old cultural thing. So, partly that manifested in a certain discontent with the European Union ragging on Viktor Orban and his explicitly illiberal regime in Hungary. His explicitly illiberal regime and style of politics, let's put it like that. So the Law and Justice Party was not comfortable with the direction they thought the European Union was taking. In general, they wanted it to be more democratic, less centralized, and wanted it to have less authority over the affairs of member states. So that, in conjunction with the immigration issue, created some discontent in Poland, and they won power exploiting that discontent, basically. Now, that's all good and well, but there was a problem. And that problem happened just before the new government took power, but after the election. And what happened was the previous government, which I think had been center-left, please correct me on that if I'm wrong, but the previous center-left government in Poland basically appointed a bunch of new judges to the judicial system, to Poland's court system, right before the handoff happened. And this immensely agitated the Law and Justice Party, because they had thought, since they'd won the election, that they should be the ones to appoint those judges. Now, because that happened, they felt kind of cheated. You know, technically it was legal, but they felt that it had kind of broken a democratic norm. So after that, they went after the court system. Specifically, they said that it needed to be reformed because it hadn't really been changed that much since the communist period. And there's some credence to that. You know, even objective observers have argued that Poland's justice system needs to be reformed, that it's too slow, and that there's probably, not necessarily that there's too much communist influence, but people on the right say that there's still too many people left over from the communist period and that they need to be ejected. But even objective observers argue that there are structural issues with the judiciary that need to be addressed. So, under the guise of that argument, the Law and Justice Party started reforms in which they basically tried to, well, the end result is that a lot of people that were appointed by them to the court system. And I'm blanking out on the exact nature of the reforms, because there's been a lot of different things that they've done. I want to say that the initial reform effort was court appointments. I think they wanted to create a number of new seats on the judiciary so that they could basically stack the court. You know, before it had been mostly people that had been appointed by the previous government, but they wanted to create a bunch of new seats such that the distribution of seats would have been filled mostly by people appointed by Law and Justice. I think the more recent thing they did was try to force people to retire. They wanted to create a new retirement age by which you had to retire, and so a lot of people in the court system were above that age, so it was kind of seen as a de facto effort to remove people and appoint law and justice appointees. So all of these efforts did not sit well with people in, well, certainly outside certainly with the European Union, but also with a lot of people in Poland who are more liberal-minded. They say that the Law and Justice Party is itself in breach of democratic norms. Technically, all of this is legal. That's important to point out. Technically, everything that's been done has been legal. But the question is it in keeping with liberal democratic norms? Because there's a feeling that the Law and Justice Party is using legal means to try to basically take over the judicial system and stack it so that they can do whatever they want. So that they can pass laws that might not otherwise get passed. Which is not quite in keeping with liberal democratic norms, which require debate, discourse, and consensus. There's a sense that Law and Justice has discarded those norms and is using legal means to try to exact its power, to try to get its way regardless of what opposition thinks. Now, the Law and Justice Party, in contrast, counters that, no, everything they've done has been legal, many of these reforms are necessary, and that the European Union and liberal Poles are being unreasonable. And in particular, with the case of the liberal Poles, they cite the example of the previous governments basically making that rush of appointments just before the Law and Justice Party took power, as an example of how liberals in Poland are being disingenuous when they complain about law and justice, and how really they just don't like their politics. And certainly there's a lot of tension between people in Poland who are relatively more liberal, who tend to be living more in the cities, and people who vote more for the Law and Justice Party, who are more rural and much more socially conservative. So sort of a traditional urban-rural divide there in terms of cultural issues. So the Law and Justice Party argues that their opponents are being disingenuous and that really they just don't like how socially conservative the party is. They don't like their nationalist reforms, and that they're not, how do I put this? That they're not nationalists, that they're cosmopolitans who are rootless and who are not really don't really have any pride in being Poles. If this argument sounds familiar, then it should, because this is basically debate happening all over Europe, not just Poland, between people who are more conservative, a little more nationalistic, and people who are more cosmopolitan and urban or a little more liberal. So this is basically Poland's manifestation of these political dynamics. So this situation has resulted in a problem for the European Union, because part of the European Union, I shouldn't say law, part of the European Union's ethos, let's put it like that, is that member states have to be democratic. And well, not just democratic, but liberal democratic. You can pass, you can do a lot of things, you can run your country how you want, but at the very least, your political culture and institutions should be liberal democratic. And there have been concerns raised that the law and justice regime, government, however you want to put it, in Poland is in breach of those norms. And so the European Union then is investigating whether or not it should apply some degree of sanctions in order to try to encourage Poland, and Hungary for that matter, to try to return more to that liberal democratic tradition. Now, all of that is very controversial because that's technically kind of a breach of sovereignty. The Poles and the Hungarians argue that how they run their country is their business and that the European Union should butt out. And more to the point, that their governments are purely democratic, and that liberal democratic is a fuzzy term anyway, and that the European Union isn't really trying to enforce liberal democratic institutions so much as it's just cracking down on politics and governments it doesn't like. That's more the Polish perspective, the law and justice perspective anyway. So this has created a problem for the European Union, because on the one hand, there is a sentiment, a firmly held sentiment amongst many out in other parts of the European Union, that Hungary and Poland are slipping, at the very least, in terms of liberal democratic governance, and that the European Union should do something to ensure that other countries that might want to follow that example do not do so thinking they can get away with it completely. And certainly to try to deter people from becoming even more more illiberal in their politics in the European Union. The trouble is that the institutional mechanism that the European Union has to enforce liberal democratic politics in member states is very weak. So right now, there's an right now the policy mechanism being used is basically involves an investigation to verify whether or not the allegations are true, and then a vote, basically, I think in the Council of Europe, maybe the Parliament, to determine whether or not there's enough evidence to condemn the target country of being in breach of the norms in question. And then if that vote passes, then they wag their finger at them and tell them to change.
We're
which is
upset
about
with you.
Yeah.
If you don't change, we'll be even more upset with you.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, that's not a great deterrent. Now, they do have another mechanism in place which involves another investigation and a stricter set of voting criteria. I think this other criteria involves a majority vote by the Council of Europe and a majority vote by the European Parliament. And it might be a consensus vote in the Council of Europe, I don't quite remember. But if those votes pass, then the target country loses its voting rights in the European Union. Now that would be very serious. That actually represents a fair amount of leverage. But the trouble is, it's not clear that you could get the votes. I think it's not just a majority vote in that case. I think it's a super majority vote. You have to have like 2/3, I think, of the Parliament and 2/3 of the Council. Maybe consensus in the Council even. I can't quite remember. But the thing is, Hungary is going to vote in support of Poland regardless. Because, of course, that has the same problem. So there's the question of whether or not Poland or Hungary will sabotage votes on one or the other. So it's not clear that the stricter mechanism that would deny voting rights is actually even possible. It may be that the most the European Union can do is use the weaker mechanism, which just castigates them and encourages them to change. So the European Union is doing something, but the something they're doing is pretty much irrelevant. It's mostly symbolic. They might try to use the stricter mechanism, in which case if it passed, it would have very real repercussions, but it's not clear it would actually work, given the voting requirement. So that's a quick summary of the situation in Poland and some of the history and kind of where the situation is now. I'm sure I skipped a bunch of stuff. I haven't thought about it in a while, but that's a rough summary of where things are at and where the political cleavages are. if I had to make a prediction, I would predict that the European Union, true to its history, will be ineffective and will do probably flip all to Poland over the long run. I don't really think they have it in them to really do anything of substance to deter the Law and Justice Party from their current course. The Law and Justice Party, for its part, seems like it's going to keep doing what they're doing, but it's not clear to me that they're going to make like a power play and become an outright authoritarian state. I don't think that's really quite what they have in mind. So hypothetically, they could lose the next election, and there could be kind of a balancing. Like, you know, the institutional changes that have been made could be reversed, and there could be new rules and new laws put in place to try to ensure more compliance with democratic norms, or maybe just the outright institutionalization of democratic norms, so that they're harder to break, such that confidence is restored in liberal democratic institutions in Poland. That could well happen in future. But that's speculation on my part. You know, I don't follow the politics closely there, so I don't really know the latest development. So to get back to the question, what do you know of the current political situation of Poland? Kind of outlined that. The government standing with its own citizens. There's a lot of polarization in Poland between the rural conservatives and the urban liberals. So that's it. The government standing with its own citizens depends on which citizen you're talking about, basically. And the European Union covered that. So I think we pretty thoroughly covered that. If I missed a bit, if I missed something, please feel free to ask again. Let's see, next question. Do you feel like it's fair to say you are more concerned with the means, consequences, and results of policy rather than being subscribed to a particular ideology? Yeah, I think in general, that's the approach I try to take on here. Because I don't think if you knew me, if you knew more about me, you probably wouldn't care about my opinions.
Well,
so I'm doing
that.
people a favor. I think I'm doing people a favor by just avoiding the opinions bit.
If I can interject, I think to not take an opinion and know more than most people about most of this stuff is startling to your average listener, because there are people who know fuck all, who will talk to you for hours and hours about how things should be and this and that. So, ideologically speaking, you're not someone who is really drummed up by the usual emotional appeals and stuff like that. So I know you outside of this Agent Smith segment, and this is usually how you talk about the world and current events and politics and stuff like that, where it doesn't really have that slant. You're not specifically focusing on the good guy, bad guy paradigm. It's more about how the story is developing and what's happening and trying to understand it. That's kind of your perspective. And I think a lot of people have that desire, like they listen to you talk and they're like, but what team is he cheering for? I need to know this. And that's that's the thing. That's human psychology. We want to know what team people are on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. I'm not particularly opinionated in the first place, as Neuro points out. But in general, I probably do, occasionally have an opinion. But I've never felt particularly compelled to share it, or to try to impose it on people. The thing about opinions is that they're just basically unverified facts. They're things people assume to be facts but haven't verified. That's the difference between an opinion and a fact, in a nutshell. And for me, if your opinion is unverified, then why bother? Why not just try to verify it and make it a fact? Or if you can't verify it, then don't have that as an opinion. If it's been disproven, then why would you believe that? So better to focus on what you can know than what you think you might know. That's my opinion. If you want an opinion, there's an opinion.
Well, and to be transparent about myself, I am a left-leaning person. I'm not really afraid to admit that, but I try to be really open, and I try to actively listen to people who have other opinions. So if I can make it a welcoming environment where conservatives can listen and feel like they gain something, and progressives can, and moderates can, then that's kind of the best case scenario, rather than specifically making media for people of a particular ideology. Because between two people, you can usually find some common ground. Not always, but more often than not, if you're having a conversation with someone else, there's some stuff you can agree on. So conversationally speaking, you can choose whether you want to be confrontational and try to debate them on something, or try to kind of share some information and gain knowledge together. Some of that is personality based, but yeah.
No, that's a really good approach. You know, it's one of the reasons that I've always enjoyed talking with you, and why I think we can kind of get more out of conversation about politics than you know, if we just beat each other or beat people over the head with this, that, or the other opinion. You know, I try to focus on that, yeah. I try to focus just on information and trying to understand the dynamics behind something, rather than trying to take a proselytizing position.
But some people love to do that, and you can probably find that content somewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
There's not a shortage.
Yeah, no shortage, certainly. Let's see, so, yeah, and that's pretty much of that. The 9/11 attacks happened because a certain group of people had a certain agenda. Do you perhaps know of which country's interests these people serve? Probably none. Because here's the thing. Contrary to popular belief, the Saudi government, as well as most governments in the Middle East, do not really get much out of supporting terrorists. They will support rebels in one area or another against a rival state, but they do not explicitly support terrorists for the sake of terrorist goals. You know, generally, if they're supporting a rebel group that uses terrorism, they're supporting it because they're a rival of another state and they want to undermine them. You know, that's pretty much been what's going on in Syria. But I don't think anybody would support a terrorist group just so that they can go out and commit terrorist attacks against, say, the West. That's very self-defeating. Because terrorist groups target regimes in the Middle East most of all. The principal targets of Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups in the Middle East are actually the governments of the Middle East. You know, the United States and Western governments are peripheral targets. They're not really that important. They encourage people who are radical extremists in those places to take up the sword on their behalf, but radical groups in the Middle East do not really go out of their way to attack Westerners in the West. They've got their hands full attacking authoritarian regimes in the Middle East itself. So the Saudi government, for its part, has been particularly threatened by radical extremists over its time, and it goes out of its way to implement a strict security regime to make sure those people do not move around much in the region, move around much in the country, and cannot raise funds freely. It still happens. You know, that's to be expected. There is some sentiment in support of them amongst a minority of the population. And there's only so much there's only so much police can do in any case. But it is not the policy of the Saudi government to attack the United States with terrorists. That would be stupid. You know, in fact, the Saudi government goes out of its way to cooperate with the United States on counterterrorism because terrorists are a common enemy. So I don't think the 9/11 attackers were part of some grand conspiracy on the part of certain interest groups in the Middle East or elsewhere, you know, the Illuminati or what have you, to inconvenience the United States. Here's the thing about 9/11. As a terrorist attack, it was immensely destructive and it killed a lot of people. But the United States is a country of 300 million people and a $20 trillion economy. We can recover. We handled 9/11. Most of the major effects of 9/11 were not did not happen directly because of 9/11. It was not the planes that flying into the buildings that caused the most damage. Most of the impact from 9/11 happened because of the U.S. government's response to 9/11. Now, you could argue that that was the plan, that, you know, certainly Al-Qaeda has long wanted to goad the United States into a war in the Middle East and Afghanistan. That had actually been an objective. Mission accomplished in that regard. But I don't think they were doing it in the service of some other group or country or wider interest or conspiracy. I don't think there was any planned in that vein. You know, 9/11 itself was manageable. You know, the United States recovered very quickly. In fact, you know, if there hadn't been so much bureaucratic bullshit, they probably could have just rebuilt the Twin Towers within a matter of 5 years. And it would have been like it never happened. In terms of policy, the impact was much greater, but even there, you know, what's been gained? Yes, the United States has been weakened in a series of wars in the region that it probably didn't need to fight and could have managed much better. But overall, I don't think any greater interest has been served by that. So I would be hard-pressed to try to justify 9/11 as being the extension of some grand conspiracy to, what, undermine the United States, destroy the United States? I mean, it's a very weak argument.
Well, I feel like the people who perpetrated the event were going to be certain that it was not going to destroy the entire country.
Mm.
It was kind of falling back to that symbolism concept of representing, taking some issue with a country and showing that that country is vulnerable in some capacity.
Mm.
And we still pay the cost every time you go to the airport. I don't know how often you go to the airport, but I traveled a good bit pre 9/11. My father worked for airline industry kind of stuff, so we got really cheap plane tickets, and it used to be you just go to the airport, you go to the gate, and you sit down and you get on the plane. Whereas now we have the TSA, so there's an entire government industry dedicated to raising the security level, which for the average person who's going to fly on a plane, they're not a terrorist, they're not going to do anything like that, but they have cost us all time. So there is inconvenience, but it's not one of those things where they're going to defeat this country by this act. So in a similar vein, it's kind of like what country or organization would choose to back this group that's going to do this terrorist attack for this outcome? It doesn't make a whole ton of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, Al-Qaeda definitely had an agenda as far as why they wanted to perpetrate the attack. But I don't think, as far as their connection to some other group or acting as puppets for another, I don't think that's the... I don't think there's any evidence, substantive evidence to that effect. Let's see. Curious for your perspective on Khashoggi. While it's clear that it's a bad thing that they did, this doesn't seem to be vastly out of the ordinary for governments. Do you think that it is that exceptional, or is it just gruesome enough to make the news? It's true that governments assassinate dissidents with, maybe not frequently, but yeah, it happens. And generally it doesn't make the news. What's exceptional about the Khashoggi case, and really about any case like this, is that, for one, the government in question assassinated the dissident in question outside of their own borders. You know, I think Eddie Izzard, there's a comedian named Eddie Izzard, and he had a bit back in the day about how it's perfectly okay for you to slaughter people in your own country, but as soon as you start killing people outside your own borders, that's the problem. You can't do that. So it's similar here. You know, if you want to kill dissidents in your own country, hey, that's your business. But when you start assassinating people outside your borders, okay, we have a problem now. Because that violates the sovereignty of other countries. It brings into question your respect for the law of your neighbors. It's a problem, yeah.
Yeah,
so that's
but
part
I
of
mean,
what...
yeah, it's extra bad, you could say. Because it's bad to be just killing people willy-nilly, but it's extra bad to be killing people willy-nilly in other people's front yard. Because then they have a mess.
Yeah. So that's part of what made the Khashoggi case exceptional. Another aspect to the Khashoggi issue that made it exceptional was the fact that they killed him in the Saudi embassy. Now, technically, embassies are sovereign soil of the countries to which they belong. So, hypothetically, you can do that. In fact, you could argue that technically they killed him on Saudi territory.
But is there even soil in the embassy? Is there even earth and dirt?
Well,
and is it from Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's kind of the thing. Technically, it's sovereign soil, but you're not supposed to abuse it, right? It's kind of understood as a norm of diplomacy that you don't abuse it, like the Saudis have abused it by assassinating somebody within it. So that in and of itself was a break in diplomatic norms, and that made it exceptional as well. And so then the third thing that made it exceptional is that Khashoggi was a resident of the United States. He was not a citizen, but he was a resident. He was living in the United States legally, he had a visa, and he was writing, I think, a column for the New York Times or the Washington Post or something. So he was in the United States legally and working. And so, while technically, if somebody with residency in the United States, you know, travels overseas and getting assassinated, that's not necessarily the business of the United States government. That's not the same as a citizen getting assassinated, which is almost an act of war. You know, somebody with residency, well, it's unfortunate, but not much we can do about it. But it is considered something of an insult, right? If you assassinate somebody with American residency and who's temporarily visiting another country, mind you, they're not visiting their own country. If they'd killed him in Saudi Arabia while he was visiting, the US probably would have shrugged it off. Okay, fine. But Khashoggi went out of his way to avoid Saudi Arabia. He went to an embassy in Turkey and got killed there. So in a sense, that kind of implies that having US residency is not a guarantee that you're safe. Now, the United States government would not argue that having US residency means you have the protection of the US government. But it is kind of protection. It is a sort of pseudo-protection. It gives you elevated status than if you didn't have it. And so for the Saudi government to very cavalierly assassinate someone in another country, in an embassy, and someone who had US residency, all of that together made the Khashoggi case exceptional. And that's why everybody is kind of coming down harder than they would have otherwise if the Saudis had killed another dissident in some other way. So I think we kind of covered that. Let's see. There's been a lot of countries that shifted towards right-wing politics recently, US, Brazil, UK, and so on. Are there specific reasons for this, or is this just the usual polarizing and ebb and flow in politics, and will it pass again? So I think we've actually talked about this before at some length. I think the broader shift towards the right is not really a shift towards the right. I think what we're seeing around the world is a realignment of politics in almost every country. So traditional political coalitions that have defined traditional political parties and groups are breaking down, and they're going to be replaced by new political coalitions and new political groups. That's what I mean by realignment. And it's happening because of, as we've talked about before, again, structural economic change. You know, the changes that have been caused by new technologies, by globalization, by free trade, by global migration, all of these changes are coming together to change the way that people make a living. They change the assumptions that people can make about the economy and how to survive in the economy. There's a lot more uncertainty now than there used to be. And because of that, there's a lot of churn, right? And not just the uncertainty, but, you know, realized uncertainty. Like, a lot of traditional jobs are going away. A lot of traditional understandings about what jobs are secure and what jobs are not secure, that's changing. You know, if you want to just work at the same place and have a secure job and live a risk-averse life, you kind of can't do that now because nobody really knows how to do that in the new economy. And it may be that the new economy is so inherently dynamic that you can't have a stable job going forward. It may be that just it's inherently defined by constant churn and that it's constantly unstable. So a lot of the disruption caused by the emergence of the new economy and a lot of the dynamism and instability inherent to the nature of the new economy, these factors are creating political and social instability. And societies are all working through that political instability because they're all being affected by it. Everybody's affected by all of these kinds of fundamental economic changes. And everybody's working through it in a different way. You know, the changes manifest differently in different societies, even though they're all being affected equally by them. Well, some more than others, but everybody's being affected by them, but the effects are manifesting in different ways depending on social system, political system, etc. And frequently, the dynamic that emerges is one of a divide between the people that embrace the changes, that embrace globalization, that embrace the social and economic changes that are occurring, and people who want to fight against them to preserve the things that they perceive are being threatened or being lost. So national identities are perceived to be under threat by the changes, so there's more nationalism. Traditional jobs, industry and manufacturing are perceived to be under threat, so there's a desire for more protectionism to prop up manufacturing. You know, these are just some examples, individual examples that are popping up in a number of countries, but they're not popping up in every country. You know, every country's example of this polarization is going to be different, and it's going to reflect the unique political circumstances of their individual countries. So that's a quick summary of why I think it's happened, why I think that dynamic is happening, why I think there's been a shift towards the right. It's not really a shift towards the right. It's more of a kind of political realignment wherein populist political forces that are resentful of the kinds of social and political and economic changes that are happening not only in their own countries but around the world, well, specifically in their own countries, are trying to fight back against them. And they're trying to create new political coalitions to try to realize their political preference to that effect. So is it just the usual polarizing ebb and flow in politics? No, I think this is kind of a unique moment in history. There have been moments like this in history before. You know, the Industrial Revolution kind of had a similar effect, but eventually equilibrium returns, right? Eventually the instability ends, people understand how things work after the changes kind of settle down, and a new political and economic equilibrium is reached, and there's stability again. So what we're seeing now is a period of instability as the changes cause as changes necessitate a new equilibria that has not been reached yet. So it's one of those sort of maybe not a black swan event, but it's just one of those periodic events in history that stem from great change that require new equilibria that people have to figure out and navigate and negotiate. And will it pass again? Definitely. You know, I think eventually we'll reach a point where things do settle down, and we do have an understanding of how to survive and thrive in the new economy, what's expected of people, etc., such that people are less afraid that they're not going to be able to make it. Once people kind of know what's expected of them, they can adjust accordingly, and then they can kind of live with some semblance of certainty. But until we reach that point, there's going to be a lot of political churn. And so we're going to keep seeing politics like what we've seen over the past 5-10 years. If an electoral system is structured so that a minority party will consistently win majority representation, is that still considered a democratic system? Yes, because democratic does not mean that the majority always wins, necessarily. Because keep in mind, you can design democratic institutions in different ways. So for example, with liberal democratic institutions, the majority does not always win. Invariably, you give power to minorities to prevent certain laws from being passed, prevent majorities from doing whatever they want, basically. So the idea then of a minority party consistently winning, that kind of toes the line a bit. That's a bit different. That has to do more with electoral institution. But you could still call it democratic, because fundamentally you are still having the elections, and there are democratic mechanisms in place. Now, what you could say is that it's not very fair. You could certainly accuse such a system of being unfair. But fairness is subjective. And if you want to replace it with what you think is a more fair system, you're going to have to negotiate with the people who think it is fair. And that could be very tricky. So, really this question has to do with the United States, because there is some evidence that the House of Representatives at the national level is designed in such a way, well, I shouldn't say the House of Representatives, but basically the way districts are drawn up for the House of Representatives in many states are gerrymandered such that a given political party can generally win those pretty consistently, even if they don't necessarily have the most votes nationally. So if you look at the national politics of the United States, you may find that one party or the other has majority support, but because of the way the districts are designed spatially, the House of Representatives does not reflect that majority, but rather is controlled by the other party. Hypothetically, mathematically, that is possible. So there is some criticism of the electoral institutions in the United States as a result. So are U.S. institutions then still democratic, given that dynamic is in play? Still democratic, I would argue, but maybe not fair. But how do you change them? Here's the thing. If you want to change them, you have to come up with a way that is not perceived as being unfair by some other group. And it's not clear to me what obvious system you could implement that would do that. Because like I was saying earlier, every policy has its cost and benefit. And so it's not the case that you can just objectively make electoral institutions in the United States more fair. You're going to piss off somebody, most likely. All the more so given that any effort to reform the system is going to be perceived as partisan. You know, the party that benefits from the status quo isn't going to want to change it. But the party that wants to change it probably only wants to change it because they're the party that's disadvantaged. So there's always going to be that partisan angle that can be brought up. If you want to change it, you're going to have to paint it as being an objective reform being done to make the system as a whole better, not necessarily one that's inherently more fair. Keep in mind, the House of Representatives as an institution is only meant to give to assign representation to states according to population. How those seats are, distributed actually depends on the politics of individual states. So this is not really a problem that you can solve nationally. This is a problem that you have to resolve on a state-by-state basis. You have to get each state to try to change how they apportion seats in the House of Representatives, or how they design the districts, whatever your proposed solution would be. And you'd have to do that for basically all of the states, and that's a very difficult proposition. In a decentralized political system, it's very hard to get coordination on something that big. Again, whether or not you want to do that and how you do that, all of that gets into very subjective territory, so I won't delve too deeply into that. But basically, whether or not it's democratic is kind of subjective. I would kind of argue it's still democratic. Whether or not it's fair, probably unfair. You could probably make a pretty strong argument it's unfair. But as far as whether or not it's democratic, debatable. That kind of gets into a whole conversation about electoral systems, what systems are quote-unquote best. I don't think there's any one best system, because invariably somebody gets screwed over. There's invariably some group that feels it's disadvantaged by the way the electoral system is set up. Really the only... Sorry, go ahead.
One little psychological interjection here, too, is a lot of times we speak in terms of democratic or not democratic, or good or bad, broken or working, where it usually falls on a spectrum of, can we get something that's better? How democratic is this, rather than is it democratic or not? How can we make it more democratic and more representative? And seeing that makes it more of a process, rather than more of a giant switch that's in some government room that we have to decide if we're going to flip it or not.
Yeah.
It's based on the norms of the society, which is a very organic process that takes change across the whole population, rather than just a decision here or there that is a yes-no question.
Yeah.
Which is simpler to think about. It's like a mental shortcut we make for ourselves, rather than what actually happens in reality.
Yeah. Yeah, people of divergent views on how electoral institutions should be designed will meet in the U.S. political institutions and negotiate and navigate those differences and reach some kind of consensus agreement eventually. That's how the process works. And so that's how it's going to be resolved, hypothetically. That's how it's supposed to be resolved. But it does come down to norms and perceptions. It is subjective, so it is going to come down to those different people kind of feeling each other out and getting a sense of what kind of system they want, what they're willing to give up, and what they kind of want in return. But really, the only way to kind of really settle subjective issues like that satisfactorily, in the long term, beyond reaching a consensus, and if you have a strong enough democratic set of norms in society, in which people can agree to a consensus, reach a consensus, even if they have divergent views, that's the gold star ideal. That's great. That's kind of what you want. But if you can't have that, the only alternatives are, one, have a sufficiently homogeneous culture such that you don't have divergent views to begin with. That's not really something you can change after the fact, though, unless you want to be Hitler or something. So other than that, the only other option is to decentralize, whereupon you decentralize the power of government away from the top, such that lower levels of government have more authority, and such that it doesn't really matter as much what the electoral institutions at the national level are, because the national level institutions don't really have any power to do anything. So those are kind of your three options there. Take your pick. Let's see, how are you doing?
Me? Or is that a question for you in the chat?
No, I mean you. I mean, how are you feeling all right? How are we doing on time, I mean?
Yeah, I'm thinking another 20 to 30. I've been live for 10 hours 45.
Oh, wow.
No, 10 hours 51.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm doing pretty all right.
All right. Well, you don't force yourself on my account.
No, it's good.
You have to be extremely tired after 10 hours.
I did 13 yesterday. So
really?
This is just for kids. This is an easy one. Just
all right, man.
Easy 11 hour, you know.
Fair point. All right, let's see. Thoughts on Greece wanting their Parthenon marbles back from England as a result of the Brexit negotiations. I have heard nothing about that. Parthenon. I'm guessing this must be some artifacts that the Greek government wants back, but generally it's not uncommon for countries that have had historical artifacts taken by imperial powers of one sort or another at one time or another, asking for those artifacts back. So it wouldn't surprise me if the Greek government asked the British government for some Greek artifacts back, but I haven't heard anything about it being tied to Brexit. Yeah, so I guess I can't really comment on this because I don't know the story in question. I'll try to look into it, but it would really surprise me if they linked it to Brexit somehow. I can't imagine the Greek government really caring all that much about Brexit one way or the other.
Oh, come on, dude. The link is obvious. The link is symbolism. Oh, yeah. Brexit was about symbolism. Artifacts are about symbolism. If you're gonna drum up your symbolism, then we're gonna get some symbolism too. We're not gonna let you do all the symbolic actions here.
That's a fair point.
Is anyone gonna use this artifact? Like maybe it's gonna be in a museum. Do we care? Not really, but it's symbolic.
Well, I would agree with you if not for the fact that the Greek government has no significant ties to the UK, really. Because the countries in Europe that care the most about Brexit are the ones that have the strongest economic ties to Britain. And Ireland, which obviously has the whole border Belfast agreement thing. Good Friday Accords, rather, that's what Good Friday Agreement. Ireland obviously is motivated by the Good Friday Agreement as well as its economic ties. But the Netherlands and Germany, to a lesser degree, and Denmark all have pretty strong economic ties, so they tend to be the ones who have the most invested. But Greece, not so much. I mean, they get tourists from Britain, but they get tourists from everywhere. I don't think British tourists are such a large proportion of Greek tourism that they can swing the Greek government to care about Brexit in any substantive fashion. So I have no idea what's up about that. I guess they might threaten Britain. They could threaten to scupper the Brexit agreement, such as it is, if they don't give them their artifacts back, but that would be unusually aggressive for Greece.
Give us our goddamn artifacts and no one gets hurt.
Could be, but I would be surprised if that was the case. I'll try to look into it, though.
That belongs in our museum.
Indiana Jones references besides. I'm trying to get a better understanding of the Asylum process. I've heard that people who are in the country legally/illegally are looking to obtain Asylum. If we know they are crossing the border illegally, should they be granted Asylum sent back?
Asylum?
Oh, sorry, Asylum. Thank you.
Did you not play Batman? It's okay.
Nope. Nope. If I had, I probably pronounced it wrong then, too.
Okay.
Wait, which was it? Asylum? Is that it?
Yeah, Arkham Asylum, Batman.
Okay. That's one of those words I pronounce wrong most of my life, so sometimes I forget what the...
Well, you're our resident friend who reads more than he talks, so this is also practice for you. And my stream is all about embracing your mistakes, so you can embrace your mistakes here and it's fine.
Oh, thank you.
Yep. If anyone makes fun of you, I will ban them forever. And they can be sad forever.
Well, negative feedback is constructive feedback too, in a way. It has its role.
Sure.
Let's see. But as far as asylum, technically I think you can seek asylum if you are here in the United States specifically illegally. I'm assuming the person asking the question is referring to the United States specifically. So I think technically you can ask for asylum if you're here illegally, but I think there are restrictions on it. Like, I think there's some you can, some you can't.
You can ask, but you have to ask very nicely.
I think the normal procedure is to apply while you're abroad, or if you're here legally, one or the other. I think that's how it works. I think if you're here illegally, you can apply for asylum if you have like an extreme case. Like if you think you're going to be tortured or something like that, if you're sent back, then you can ask for it. But I don't think you can like be here in the United States illegally, get caught by ICE, and then plead, oh wait, I'm whatever. I have whatever random thing I can't be sent back home for. Yeah, I'm reminded there was some cases of some people in Europe. It's not the United States, but there were some asylum seekers in Europe who were trying to pretend that they were homosexual, I think it was. Because they were pleading that they were, if they'd be sent back, that they would be oppressed or killed even. If they were, found out, basically. But then they kind of asked some questions, and there's some ambiguity as to whether or not they were telling the truth, basically. So there's kind of a moral hazard there, as far as asylum goes. But I think it's perfectly legitimate to ask for asylum when you're here in the United States illegally. But it has to be a pretty extreme case, I would think. I think that's the case. Don't take my word on that. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not the best person to ask. But that's my impression. Now, if we know they are crossing the border illegally, should they be granted asylum? That's a subjective question. How you answer that comes down to personal political preferences, and those are going to differ from person to person. I kind of leave that to individuals to decide for themselves. If you allow people to apply if they're here illegally, then obviously there's a moral hazard, because then you could just come here illegally and then apply for asylum, whether you deserve it or not. Quote unquote deserve. Obviously that's subjective too. But on the other hand, it may be that you can't really wait around for the bureaucracy. It may be that you actually do deserve asylum, but that you can't afford because of the authorities that are after you, or because somebody's trying to kill you, to wait to get a visa. So you may jump the border in that case. Although that would be a pretty unusual case. Most of the people here in the United States illegally are actually here after they overstay a tourist visa. I think that's the case. The people who actually jump the border with Mexico represent a minority. So there's not that many of those people. So I don't think a lot of the people who come here seeking asylum would overstay their visa and then seek asylum, although that's entirely possible. But you can make the case that whether or not you need asylum is irrelevant to whether or not you're in the country legally. I suspect that would be the argument against. Whether you're in the United States with a legal visa or not has no bearing on whether or not somebody in your home country wants to kill you for one reason or another. So you could well make the argument that people deserve to make a claim for asylum regardless of their legality, their immigration status, because of that fact. It may be that nobody wants to kill you when you're here legally, but maybe you overstay your visa and then circumstances change in your home country and then somebody does. So then maybe you should be allowed to claim asylum for that reason. But again, there's that moral hazard to deal with, and so it may be that bothers people more, basically. Again, subjective question, it just comes down to individual preferences. So that's the last of the questions here. We can either end it here, or I can freestyle for a little while, depending on preferences.
Let's freestyle for 15 minutes. I'm feeling pretty okay.
Okay. Let's see. I think if I had one thing I could choose to go with, I would go with the draft Brexit agreement. Because there was finally one hashed out, although it's not official, but it's probably going to be the one they go with. So basically, there's been a lot of hemming and hawing and kabuki theater in the Brexit negotiation as it reaches its crescendo. Because Brexit is going to leave the EU one way or the other, and I think it's March of next year. But the thing is, there has to be an agreement in place soon, like within the next month or two. in order for that to be to be feasible. Basically, there's a lot of deadlines. Legislatures disband, leave for vacation, what have you, etc. So it kind of has to be soon. So there's a sense that the deadline is looming, that an agreement has to be finished. And so there's been some last-minute negotiations on the Irish border issue, on customs, etc. And so they think that they have a nominal agreement in place. And what's going to happen is that they're going to, well, let me read my notes here so that this makes some sense. So basically, the agreement that they've come to is a de facto customs union. And this is the backstop, mind you. They've already got the, all right, let me backtrack even further. There's already an agreement in place to continue the status quo as far as the UK's position vis-a-vis the single market in the European Union for the next 2 years. So technically, the UK will leave the EU in March of next year. But that's not really going to mean anything substantively as far as economic relations between them, because they're basically going to freeze the current economic relationship in place until 2020. And the reason they're doing that is so that they can have time to negotiate a free trade deal. So that's there's a technical name for that, but I forget. But basically, that's how that's going to play out. The problem that's been encountered in the negotiations is the quote-unquote backstop. And so what the backstop is the default agreement that will be implemented in 2020 if no trade agreement can be agreed to by then. And the reason that's felt necessary is because of Ireland and the Irish border issue. And if you're not familiar with that, then, well, I don't know if I can explain it in 15 minutes, but let me try to summarize it as much as I can. Basically, there was a lot of violence in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants that kind of tied into Irish nationalism, etc. And the agreement that ended that violence was called the Good Friday Agreement. And part of the crux of that agreement is that there can be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So long as the UK was part of the EU, that wasn't a problem, because basically being in the EU meant there weren't really any real borders between you and the other EU members, including Ireland. But then the UK voted to leave the EU. Oh shit.
Uh-oh.
That's not so simple. So how do you navigate that? How do you give the UK the ability to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries while without imposing a hard border with Ireland? It wasn't really clear how that could happen. So there's a lot of negotiating that went on, and so the agreement, the compromise, if you want to call it that, is basically a customs union. Basically, the UK will, well, again, this is the backstop agreement. Oh, I should clear that up too. The reason that's necessary as the backstop agreement is that if no free trade deal is signed by 2020, then automatically there will be a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And so a backstop agreement ensures, hypothetically, this was the desire, will ensure that if no agreement is made in 2020, then there will not be a hard border there. There will be some default agreement that will preserve the open border there. So that's what the backstop is meant to do. It's meant to preserve the Good Friday Agreement by ensuring the border stays open if no free trade deal can be met between the EU and the UK by 2020. Okay, so that said, the backstop agreement is a customs union. That's how they're going to resolve that. If no free trade agreement can be resolved by 2020, a customs union for, I believe, the whole of the UK will be implemented with the EU. And what that means is that customs will be the same for the EU and the UK. So what are customs? Basically, customs are tariffs on goods coming in from outside your country. If you're in a customs union, then you either don't charge tariffs on goods that come in with your customs union partners, or you charge them at a much lower rate. One or the other. And furthermore, you have a common set of customs, you have a common set of tariffs for goods that come in from countries outside your customs union. So this is what's going to be implemented in 2020 in lieu of a free trade agreement. The UK will be in such a customs union, and that will inherently preclude a free trade, will inherently preclude a hard border with Ireland. Now, the problem with that, even with a customs union, is that a customs union does not mean that you have the same regulations, right? All of the countries in a customs union can have different regulations. They only have to have the same customs, the same tariffs, basically. Now, if you're in the European Union single market, all of the regulations are harmonized. They're not all the same necessarily, but a lot of European Union bureaucracy is dedicated to making sure that regulations do not conflict between countries. We want to try to make regulations as similar as possible so that it's as easy as possible for businesses in one country to do businesses in the others. Now, because the UK will be leaving the EU in March of 2019, they're not going to be subject to those same restrictions on their regulations. So they'll be in the customs union, hypothetically, in the future, but there's going to be the question of regulations. So if you're the European Union, the question is, do we allow free movement of goods from the UK into the EU without inspections, given that they're going to have a different regulatory regime than ours? And the answer is no. Now, that doesn't require a hard border per se, but it does require border checks. The trouble is, that would be considered to be in violation of the Good Friday Agreement. So there will be no tariffs on goods coming from the UK into Ireland. That aspect is good, but there's the question of what to do about the inspections to ensure regulatory compliance to EU norms. So the way they're going to deal with that is they're actually going to have some border checks between Northern Ireland and the UK. Now, they're going to try to minimize them as much as possible by having some of the checks done at the site of production. Basically, if the goods are produced in the UK, they'll do the inspection in the UK at the factory, and then they'll just send them along to Northern Ireland, no problem. And I think there's also going to be some techie nonsense that they're going to try to implement. I don't know as much about that. They've also agreed to allow some of the inspections to be done by British inspectors, so they won't all have to be EU inspectors operating in the UK, which raises some, legal questions. Now, if you're Northern Ireland, you don't necessarily like this because there's the question of constitutionality. Basically, the UK and Northern Ireland is all one country, so can you have border checks between different parts of the UK? Well, not really. But it might be perfectly legal to have inspections. That's not necessarily a problem. So that's how they're going to get around it. They get around the issue of the tariffs with the customs union. They're going to get around the issue of the inspections in order to ensure regulatory compliance by having inspections in Northern Ireland ports in order to inspect goods coming from Great Britain. As well as, and this is very controversial in Britain because, again, it kind of sort of violates the constitutional integrity of the country, so to speak. But it's probably going to be legal. I think it is. I think it does pass constitutional muster. I think the bigger problem is that it's going to be very politically unpopular, especially in Northern Ireland. So there's some question about whether or not it's going to get the votes it needs to pass in Parliament. But nominally, this is what the agreement looks like, and this is how they're going to square all of the circles that they were facing. So let me see, checking my notes again. Oh, as part of the agreement, UK environmental law will also have to be at least on par with the EU by the end of the transitional period. In other words, by the end of 2020. So what that means is that UK environmental regulations can be stronger than European Union environmental regs, but they can't be weaker. They've agreed to at least do as much even after they've left the EU and after that 2020 period. That's a part of regulatory compliance. They want to, the UK will probably be able to change a lot of its regulations in ways that are not amenable with EU regs, but as far as environmental regs go, they've agreed to at least harmonize those going forward. Mind you, this is all still, the environmental regs is not the backstop agreement, but the other stuff, that's all emergency, last minute, in case we don't get the free trade agreement stuff. So that's not set in stone. But the environmental law regulation agreement, that kind of is something the UK has agreed to regardless of the free trade agreement negotiation. So from here, the deal is going to go to an EU summit on the 25th of November for approval. And if the EU nations all agree to it, then it comes back to the UK, where the UK Parliament has to agree to it. Now, the EU will probably approve it 25th November. The big question is whether or not it can survive the UK's Parliament. So the agreement is basically a soft Brexit. That's basically what they're trending towards. And there's a lot of hard Brexit people over in the Parliament that are going to vote against it. In fact, there's already a lot of talk about whether or not Theresa May will be booted out by rebellion in the Tories in Parliament. But it's not really clear they have the votes yet. But it's not clear that they won't have them in the near future. So if Theresa May loses a vote of no confidence in the UK Parliament, the deal is probably off. There will probably be elections in the UK, and there will have to be a very rapid renegotiation once those elections are over.
Do you think Emperor Palpatine can win?
No. No, I don't. No. I don't think he has the votes in Parliament.
Damn.
There might be some people who would vote for him, but I don't think there would be enough. Not quite, anyway.
Just the prequel meme subreddit. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, the big question right now is, do the Tory rebels have enough votes to get rid of Theresa May? If they don't, then the next question is, does Theresa May have the votes in Parliament to get her agreement passed? That's not clear. Because there's even a lot of people who are not hardcore, hard Brexit people in the UK Parliament who would vote against the agreement because they actually want to stay in the EU. There's a lot of people who are asking now for a new referendum to vote on Theresa May's new agreement. And their argumentation is that the Brexit referendum was only on whether or not the UK should leave the EU. It was not really on specifics of what the agreement should look like. And so they think because that was left ambiguous, that the UK public should have a new vote, given that there is specifics now to vote on, about whether or not the specifics of the new agreement are acceptable. So there are some people who are pro-EU who might vote against the agreement for that reason, so that they can get a new referendum and maybe a new government that would keep the UK in the EU. So those are the two things to look for going forward in the next few weeks. Does Theresa May survive a vote of no confidence, if there is one? And then does the UK Parliament pass Theresa May's Brexit draft agreement? If all of that goes according to plan, then things should be pretty smooth. And probably from that point, the UK can kind of just leave the EU in March, and that'll be fine. And then the new drama will be negotiating the free trade agreement. And so then we'll get to hear about that every other week for the next year or two. But for now, this is kind of what to keep an eye on. This is where the drama's at right now. So there's your Brexit update.
Sweet.
I'm looking at our country chart here. We have a lot of polls today. I guess that's because we're relatively early, isn't it?
Yeah. It's also kind of a aside. Poland is doing really well in the black metal scene. If you don't listen to that music, it doesn't matter to you, but traditionally it's been a very Scandinavian music genre, and Poland has been crushing it lately, which is cool. Random music culture fact.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So they come to your stream for the death metal then?
Black metal primarily, but yeah. Their metal scene is very strong at the moment.
Gotcha. Well, I trust I've got lots of comments from the Polish listeners from the earlier comments.
There were a couple people who came in, I saw in the chat during it, who were like, I'm Polish, what are they talking about?
Well, I look forward to seeing their perspective on the matter. It's always interesting to get the perspective of people from different countries and, you know, get corrected, certainly if I'm wrong, but also just seeing their preferences. You know, seeing how they view the world, how they view certain issues, etc. Got a lot of people from New Zealand today. That's unusual. As many from Australia.
Australia and New Zealand is heavily represented in the StarCraft scene per population.
Really? Even New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean the region is called ANZ,
Mhm.
so they take up 2 of the letters of that.
Well, I mean, okay, fair point. Fair point. But I just mean, I'm surprised that they're as prominent as that would suggest, given that the population is so small. I don't think they've got more than 10 million? Are they up to 10 million now? I think it's even that.
Yeah.
They're very quiet.
I know quite a few of them.
Oh, it's 4.7 million.
4.7. Yeah, so we have the Texas reference. The Texas reference is what? We have 28 million in our state?
Yeah, it's rather more. More than Australia, I think.
Yep.
Might be a lie. Let me check that.
It's more than Sweden.
Oh yeah, it's more than Sweden.
I think Sweden is 18.
Tiny. Less than that, I think it's more like 10. I'll check that too. Yeah, Sweden is 9.9.
Oh.
Sweden is 9.9, Finland at 5.5, Norway 5.2. And then Australia at 24.6. And Texas is at 28 million, so not that much more. Not quite at 30 yet. California is way ahead. They're 39. But yeah, New Zealand doesn't have a whole lot. Yeah, it's always very quiet there. Generally, the only time I read about New Zealand is when there's an earthquake or... What was I think the recent thing is that people are stealing... That's what it was. People are stealing avocados in New Zealand.
Oh my goodness.
Avocados are very expensive now, so the prices are high, and so
It's a
people have been
luxury
raiding
good.
the... yeah. Well, I mean, de facto at this point, so given the way the prices are. And so a lot of the avocado producers in New Zealand are having some trouble with people stealing from the avocado yards, whatever you call those. Avocado vineyard? I have no idea.
The places from which avocados emerge.
There you go.
They are beset by thieves.
Yeah, I think that's the last thing I read about them. I know they had a contentious election recently, and I think the winner only won by like a fraction of a percentage point. It was a very close election. And there were some allegations of corruption and whatnot, but I don't think anything's really come of that.
That the avocados were corrupt or something else?
I suspect somebody else, more so than the avocados. Avocados are very innocent, last I checked. Yeah, if we have some New Zealand listeners, I would certainly be interested in like a quick, 1 or 2 sentence summary of what the nation's politics are like right now. Or just what's going on, anything. Who else do we have? We got some Swiss, some Austrian. I don't know of a whole lot going on in Austria. I think in Austria, the last thing I read about Austria was Putin came. That's what it was. Vladimir Putin came to a high-level Austrian politician's birthday. And then everybody was giving them shit for it because it's Vladimir Putin, Why are you inviting him to your birthday? Mm-hmm. What are you doing? So people were a little suspicious about that. I don't think it amounted to anything more than that. If you're Austrian and I'm wrong, please do correct me. Let's see, lots of UK people, Polish people, got some Italians. What's going on in Italy? Oh, that's right. Italy, the Salvini government in Italy is trying to pass a new budget that exceeds the European Union limit on deficit spending. And so the European Union is giving them shit for it. Nominally, it's threatening them with fines, but I suspect that they're just going to shrug it off. The European Union is rather ineffective. They have a hard time coercing countries. That's kind of hard to do when you're a consensus-based institution. Yeah, the Salvini government is kind of this weird, bizarre combination of populist left and populist right political parties. They don't really agree on a lot, but they do agree on some things. Specifically that they don't like immigration, they don't like the European Union, and they want to have deficit spending. So they want to pass this budget because they think it's going to be good for the economy. I doubt it will be. I'm very skeptical. And it'd probably just make the Italy's finances worse, and they're not in good shape as is. If they matched it with some economic reforms, that might be workable, but they don't seem to have been able to do that. So I suspect more likely is that it'll just lead to a financial crisis later on. That's what everybody's worried about. Because here's the thing, Italy's debt is immense. And there's a lot of it in Europe's major banks. And if Italy defaults on that debt, it'll probably take Europe's financial sector with it. And then there will be a big financial crisis, and that ends badly for everybody. So people are very worried about it for that reason. You know, if Italy were smaller, then they would kind of shrug it off and say, yeah, whatever. You can ruin your finances as you like. That's your business. But as is, there's so much debt in the financial sector. The European Union kind of feels compelled to try harder than it might otherwise to push them to draw down that budget, to not have it be so big. But given the way politics are in Italy right now, I suspect that they're just going to push it through anyway. So we'll see what happens. That could be very interesting. If you're listening from Italy right now, I would be very interested to hear your perspective on the Italian budget. The proposed Italian budget. I think it is still proposed. So feel free to add a sentence or two somewhere in chat on that account. Oh, we had some Russians. Yeah, I think of all the people we've had from different countries listening, it's always the Russians or the Ukrainians I end up aggravating.
We did get a host from a streamer. I should know the country of origin, but I know they speak Russian.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So I get to practice my Здравствуйте. And they're like, wow, you speak Russian? Нет.
Slava Drodinya. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what I've read recently about Russia. I'm sure they've been doing something. They always are. If they're not doing something, then they're getting blamed for something. I think I'd remember that at least. No, nothing. No, the thing I read most recently about Russia is that police video. It was nothing substantive. It was just some police in, I think, Yakut province? What do they call those? It's not an oblast. It's less centralized than that. Russia has oblasts, autonomous republics, okrugs, and then it's got these just sort of territories, basically. I forget what they're called. Okray, maybe? Yakut is one of them. And some police there made a viral video. I don't even remember why they did it, but a lot of people were giving it some attention because it was humorous. I think I read something recently about violence in the Ukraine, but I know that's not unusual. It's pretty standard. Yeah, I don't remember much. It may be that the most substantive thing was the Vladimir Putin visiting Austria. Maybe the biggest recent thing. Yeah, I'm blanking out. If you're Russian and listening, please enlighten me as to what the hell's going on in Russia, because I can't remember. Oh, you know what? I do remember we had a question from a few weeks ago about the pension protests in Russia. The Russian government raised the age at which you could get your pension, and a lot of people were wicked pists and started protesting. And I think we got a question about whether or not they would actually do it, whether or not they would be able to raise the pension age. Well, no, it was whether or not the protesters would be able to stop the Russian government from raising the pension age. I don't think we ever got to that question, so I guess now that I'm remembering it, we can get to it. No, I don't think they can stop it, because the Russian government has been wanting to do that for a while. They actually wanted to do it some years ago, but didn't think they had the political capital to do it. Also, the economy had taken a hit recently, I think. I think that was kind of around the whole Ukraine thing, whole Euromaidan protest issue. And so Russia's economy, of course, was already not in great shape even before that. But yeah, the Russian economy, it's kind of a mixed bag. more to the point, Russian finances are not great. So there is kind of a desire to try to right the ship, so to speak, and try to restore the health of Russia's national government's finances by trying to relieve the pressure of pensions and pension payments by raising the age. So given how much they'd already put it off, yeah, I don't think you're going to stop them now. Especially since the protests have already kind of happened and played out. They've already incurred the political cost, so they might as well get the economic benefit. Also, the Russian government doesn't really have to care what people think too much. It's not an explicitly authoritarian country like some people make it out to be, but it is a kind of an illiberal democracy. It does fall into that category. So the Russian government has it well within its power to kind of force through changes that are unpopular if it really wants to. That is something the Putin government can do. And I suspect this is probably an example of that. Let's see, what else did we have? Oh, France. France has been in the news. Macron has been in the news, specifically. There have been protests against him. In fact, I think I had something in my notes about that. Yeah, protests in France about fuel prices. I mean, fuel prices have been going up all over the world, but the French government passed a fuel tax rise that really upset people. So there have been some big protests in France trying to get the government to reverse those that tax hike. And I think the government has not responded by reversing the tax hike, but they did say that they would spend more on some measures to help poor families, specifically to help them pay their energy and transport bills. That hasn't been enough, though, because I think the protests are ongoing. And I think polls right now say that most of the population backs the protesters. I think it was 75% back the protesters and 70% want the fuel tax hike reversed. So they've been out blocking roads and whatnot. There's been apparently some violence, because blocking roads is a really terrible way to protest. You really need to have some broad support to do that, because people are really inconvenienced by that. So unsurprisingly, they blocked some roads, and some people decided to just drive through them. People got injured, and I think one person was even killed. Although, to be fair, in that example, I think the protesters themselves attacked the car. So that's not necessarily cut and dry. But regardless, there's been some violence and some disorder on account of the protests. The takeaway is that the Macron government is somewhat embattled at this point. You know, his popularity rating is not very high. In fact, it's quite low at this point. So there's some question about just how much reform Macron and his political party can really push through at this point. You could argue that maybe Macron's on the way out, but I don't know if that's true either. As unpopular as he might be, it's not really clear what the alternative is either. I don't think any of France's other sundry political groups has really gained in popularity at the expense of Macron, such that they could really constitute a threat in the next election. If I'm wrong on that, please do correct me. I would be very interested to hear the French perspective on that.
I'm trapped in a very long game.
Well, that's all right. Let's see. I mean, there's lots of stuff I could get to. You know, I was thinking, one thing I'm thinking about, because I have a backlog that's huge of stuff in my notes here. I've just got an Excel sheet just chock full of crap that we're probably never going to get to. So I was thinking maybe one of the things I could do with the podcast, beyond the 10-minute episodes that we talked about before, maybe I could do like maybe a weekly thing where I address some of these things that I don't get to every week. It's a source of regular content, you know, just something to kind of put out there. Because there's always stuff, you know, there's always constantly stuff going on that I could kind of comment on that we don't get to. Let's see, one thing I had from my notes way back, I think this is months ago, this might have even been last year. It's not anything substantive, but I thought it was hilarious. There was a guy in Bolivia, I think it was, and he was responsible for flying, I think it was the presidential sash. Because, you know, Latin American country presidents almost always have like a big ceremonial presidential sash that they wear during, you know, important events. So there was this guy who was responsible for flying the sash over to President Morales, as you know, in time for some big event. I don't remember what it was. I think it was like a parade or something. And so this guy went to the airport and missed his flight. It's a problem. No, you know what? It wasn't a sash. I think it was a medallion. It was like a medal or something. Well, anyway, whatever it was, this guy missed his flight, and so he had some time to kill until the next flight happened. And so then, you know, he goes, and then he comes back to his car and he finds out, oh, somebody stole the stuff. Somebody broke into my car, stole a bunch of stuff, including the presidential medal. And so that made big news, of course, because then the president didn't get it. But here's the thing. It turned out that the thing the guy that was doing while he was away from his car, well, nobody knows exactly, but his car was parked in the red light district.
Wow.
And so people kind of drew their own conclusions. And so there was a lot of humor, a lot of jokes made at his expense on account of that. Lost the presidential medal in the red light district, waiting for his next flight. Whoopsie daisy. So that's not really important news, but I thought it was a cute story.
That's funny.
Oh, that's right. Bolsonaro is going to be president of Brazil. I don't. Have we talked about? Had he won by the time we had that last episode?
I think it may have been just that he won, or that it looked like he was going to win.
Okay. I think it may have happened that day, actually, now that I think about it.
I think I remember you saying overlap with Trump or something.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, I think maybe we did cover it. Bolsonaro did win Brazil's presidential election. But I've been reading a little more about him, and so there are some potential implications that we can read into it. So one of the things that he's publicly said is that he wants to align tightly with the U.S. For example, he wants to pull out of the UN Human Rights Commission, and he wants to pull out of the he wants to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord as well. So he kind of wants to align Brazilian foreign policy, it seems, more with the United States. He's also criticized China's power in Brazilian markets. He criticized the importation of bananas from Ecuador for some reason. I don't know what that's about, but he did. And he also said that he would take on the Venezuelan government. That was a little bit ambiguous, not really clear what he meant by that, but these are some examples of the ways in which he wants to change Brazil's foreign policy. And so that could create some opportunities for the U.S. I mean, obviously, it would be, Brazil would make for a pretty powerful ally in the region, given that it is the most powerful country in Latin America. But it would be a little bit weird, because Brazil kind of distanced itself from the United States in the 1960s. There was a military coup in Brazil in the 60s, and the military government was not entirely on board with U.S. foreign policy. They were anti-communist, for sure, but they were also a little bit more autarkic. They wanted more focus put on the development of Brazilian industry, and so they were not as free trade as the U.S. government might have liked. So they implemented a bunch of protectionist measures that were meant to develop Brazilian industry as a result. So there was some distancing there. There was also a desire to stake out more of an independent Brazilian foreign policy in the region and world affairs, so Brazil kind of became non-aligned. I mean, really, in the Cold War, it was still aligned with the United States, explicitly. But it did not really just do whatever the United States wanted to, especially with regard to other matters of world affairs. So that's kind of been Brazil's foreign policy since then, so it would be a big change for Brazil to kind of return to the fold, so to speak, to kind of return to an embrace of the U.S. and its foreign policy. But it would certainly be to the benefit of the U.S. That would give the U.S. a lot more leverage in the region if it could count on Brazilian support. Let's see. I doubt that Brazil would do anything substantive to Venezuela. I will say that much. I don't think when he says he's going to take them on, he really means he's going to invade them or anything like that. It's probably just maybe sanctions at most. Let's see, they might join the U.S. in challenging China. I'm sure the Trump administration would appreciate support on that front. But if the Brazilian government did that, they would probably want a quid pro quo. They would probably want the U.S. to reduce steel tariffs or to give Brazilian companies exemptions or something to that effect. And it may not be that the Trump administration is willing to do that. So, on the one hand, you might think Trump and Bolsonaro would get along, but on the other hand, strongman leaders have very transactional relationships. And it may be that they are not able to reach an agreement on a potential transactional set of agreements that would act as the cornerstone of the Bolsonaro-Trump relations. That kind of remains to be seen. It'll be interesting to see how they negotiate with each other and what kind of relations they have going forward. That'll probably be the principal determinant of how close the U.S. and Brazil get under the Bolsonaro government. But for now, at least, it seems like they're going to get closer in general. That seems to be the safest bet so far. How close remains an open question. We'll see. A lot of potential upside there, with potential ramifications for South American politics. But more something to watch at this point than anything concrete. What else do we have here? There was a terrorist attack on an FSB office in Russia. I have that in my notes. Which normally I would not think would be of much note, because, Russia has terrorist attacks now and again. That's not that unusual. But what was weird with this one was that it was done by an anarchist. It was actually an ethnic Russian anarchist who perpetrated a suicide bombing at an FSB office. Very unusual. So I don't know if that's really significant. I don't know if that means that there's a strong anarchist movement in Russia. I doubt it. I don't know if that, if you can really read into that some broader dissatisfaction amongst the broader Russian population. But it is weird. And I wonder if there might be, if there's a trend that emerges, if that happens again enough times, that could suggest that the younger population of Russia has become disenchanted with the Russian government and its legitimacy, and that there might be a resurgence in nihilism in Russia, which actually has its roots in Russian history, apparently. So that's also something to watch.
The game finally ended. 37 minutes.
Did you win?
Yes.
There you go.
I guess. The average match duration is about 12, I think. 12 to 15. So yeah, It's like, yeah, just another short game.
Well, Blizzard just wants to give you your money's worth.
Sweet. Well, it's really good having you back. Do you have any Thanksgiving plans? What's going on for that?
Sunday, I think. I think it is on Sunday, isn't it?
It's always on Thursday.
Oh, okay. That's just me then. We're having it on Sunday, I think, but I'll be available late afternoon maybe, but definitely I'll be available at night. So we can skip it if need be. That's no problem.
Yeah, I'll probably be out of town, but we should be good the weekend after that.
Okay.
Everyone, make sure you have a feast, and if you can be with family, make your own goddamn feast. Because that's what it's about, just stuffing yourself with food.
Oh, hell yeah. Go down to the grocery store and get one of those rotisserie chicken.
Yep.
I used to do that. It's not really meant to be an individual meal, but if you're a fat ass, it kind of is.
Or if you're a hungry bear.
Yeah, not bad.
Well, sweet action. It's been great being back on. Thank you, Mouse Neotech Prototype, for handling the questions, and everyone with your amazing questions for sending them.
Yep, much appreciated.
This will be on YouTube. Thank you, Agent Smith. We'll see you on the next episode.
Yep. See you next time.
GG.